Hey there, and welcome back. If you are settling in tonight, getting comfortable, letting the day fall away from you, good. Tonight's story asks for stillness, because the woman waiting inside it has been treated for 2 centuries, as if she belonged chiefly to someone else's life. To put even a little of that right, we have to sit with her for a while, as she actually was. If her name is familiar to you at all, it will probably be because of someone else. She is the answer to a quiz question. She is the footnote in a biography of a more famous person. She is the woman the Prince of Wales secretly married in 1785 in a ceremony that was illegal under 2 separate acts of Parliament when he was 23 and reckless and besotted, and she was 28 and twice widowed and reluctant. The whole thing was a private religious ritual that the law did not recognize, and that the world either pretended not to know about or whispered over constantly for the next 4.5 decades. That is who she is, in the popular memory. The prince's secret wife, the woman in the case. But she was not a footnote. She was a person with a long life of her own, and the part of it spent with him was only one portion of the whole. The time before him and the time after him mattered too. She was a Catholic widow from a Shropshire gentry family. She had been married twice before he ever saw her, both times to men older than herself, both marriages brief, both ending in widowhood before she was 25. She had been educated in a French convent. She read widely, sang well, played the harpsichord and the new pianoforte that was beginning to displace it, kept an orderly household, was loved by her servants, gave generously to Catholic charities, and helped to raise 2 adopted daughters in her later life. She was devout and serious in a period when women of that kind were not always at the centre of the social sets through which she moved. She lived to be 80. She outlived the prince who became her king, and the man once called her husband, by 7 years. She died in 1837, in the house she had occupied for the last 3 decades of her life, in Brighton, the town she loved, in her own bed, on her own terms. That is the woman we are going to spend the evening with, not the prince, not the scandal, not the political crisis of 1787, when his Whig friends denied her marriage in the House of Commons, not the abandonment of 1794, when he was forced into the disastrous match with Caroline of Brunswick, not the long second relationship from 1800 to 1811, not the deathbed in 1830, when, according to the manservant who attended him, he asked to be buried with her miniature on a chain around his neck, and was. None of that. Tonight is not his evening. Tonight is hers. The date is a Friday in late August of 1788. The setting is the modest, fashionable bathing town of Brighton, at this moment the most modish place in England outside London for the late summer months, and rapidly being remade by the patronage of the Prince of Wales. He has been coming down to it for 5 summers now, and has just had a plain classical villa built for himself overlooking the Stein. Maria Fitzherbert has her own house. It is not large, it is not grand, it is comfortable, well kept, full of her own things, run by her own household of 7 indoor servants, set on a minor street 100 yards back from the seafront. She has spent the summer there since her marriage to the prince 3 years earlier. She likes it more than she likes London. She likes the air. She likes the sea. She likes the distance this little town gives her from the great world, near enough to be seen, far enough to breathe. Most of all, she likes that the house is hers. The household runs according to her taste. The chapel where she hears Mass each morning is a brief upstairs room she has fitted out herself. The books in the library are the books she chose. The music in the music room is the music she plays. The prince has his own house, on the other side of the Stein, with his own servants, his own arrangements, and his own more extravagant style of doing things. They are not one household. She has, very deliberately, not allowed them to become one tonight. She is at home. She has had a settled day. She is now, in the late afternoon, dressing for dinner with the help of her maid Mary Smith, who has been with her since 1781 and knows her better than almost any other living person. Her uncle Henry Errington, who gave her away at her secret wedding 3 years ago, is staying with her for a fortnight and is downstairs in the library with one of the servants, going over a minor matter of business. Her friend, Lady Anne Lindsay, is coming over from her own lodging to dine. Her chaplain, Father William Hutton, has been in the narrow chapel earlier, saying his evening office, and is now also at the dinner. The dinner will be simple. The conversation will be quiet. The household will run on its accustomed rhythm. The prince, who is at the pavilion across the Stein for the season, may or may not stop by during the evening. He often does. She does not know in advance. She does not particularly need to. Her evening is her own whether he comes or not. This is the evening I want to take you inside. It is one of perhaps 1,000 evenings that Mrs. Fitzherbert spent in similar fashion across the long second half of her life. Most of them are unrecorded. Almost none of them appear in the biographies. The biographies are interested in the dramatic moments. The 1785 wedding, the 1787 parliamentary denial, the 1794 abandonment, the 1799 papal ruling, the 1811 final break, the 1830 deathbed. The drama gets the pages. The ordinary evenings, of which there were thousands, do not. We are going to spend 3 hours with one of the ordinary evenings tonight, because the ordinary evenings were her actual life, and the dramatic moments were the things that happened to her in between her actual life. And she would, I think, prefer it this way. She was, by temperament, a private woman. She would have preferred, if asked, that we sit with her in her drawing room rather than at the great public scenes she was forced through. So that is what we are going to do. Let me set the scene a little more carefully before we go in. Brighton, in 1788, is a town of about 3,500 inhabitants. It has been, for most of the 18th century, a modest fishing village called Brighthelmstone, scratching a living out of the herring and mackerel grounds in the channel, and from a little smuggling on the side. It has narrow medieval lanes, a small parish church above the town, an old Stein, which is the open ground where the fishermen had traditionally laid out their nets to dry, a spare high street, and a long shingle beach below low chalk cliffs running away to the east and west. The harbour, such as it is just the open beach where the fishing boats are hauled up at the end of each day's work. The fishing fleet still goes out every morning in the proper season, and the catch still comes in on the beach in the evening, and is sold from the back of carts that go up through the lanes calling out the price of the day's herring. For 4 decades, however, this restrained fishing village has been turning into something else. The transformation began in the 1750s, when a Sussex doctor called Richard Russell published a book in Latin recommending seawater, both bathed in and drunk, as a cure for almost every glandular and lymphatic complaint. He set up his own practice in Brighton, urged his patients to come down for the cure, built a substantial house on the Stein for those who came to bathe, and started a fashion that has continued ever since. By the 1770s, Brighton was a recognised resort. By the 1780s, with the patronage of the Prince of Wales, it has become the most fashionable resort in England. Buildings are going up, new streets are being laid out. The old fishing village is being absorbed into a new town of stuccoed terraces, lodging houses, and assembly rooms. The prince first came down for the sea air in 1783 on the recommendation of his physicians, who thought saltwater bathing might help a swelling in his neck. He liked the place. He came back the following summer, and the summer after that, and by 1786 he had taken a long lease on a modest farmhouse on the Stein, which he then had remodelled by the architect Henry Holland into a neat classical villa with a domed central rotunda and 2 flanking wings. This is the Marine Pavilion in its first form, the building that will, nearly 3 decades later, be utterly transformed by John Nash into the oriental fantasia of domes and minarets that we know now as the Royal Pavilion. But in 1788, the pavilion is still a modest classical building, white stuccoed, low, restrained, the sort of house a wealthy gentleman might build for himself by the sea. It is not yet the famous pavilion. It is just a pleasant modern house, sitting at the western edge of the Stein, with the open ground in front of it, and the sea visible beyond. Before the house comes into view, it helps to feel the plain town she has chosen as her summer place, because Brighton in 1788 has a texture that matters. The reason Brighton has become what it has become over these 4 decades is essentially medical. Sea bathing in 1788 is not yet a leisure activity in the way we now think of it. It is a treatment. The whole apparatus of the Brighton summer, the bathing machines, the dippers, the public assembly rooms, the libraries, the lodging houses, the medical men in attendance, the ordered daily rituals around the bathing itself, has been organised around the conviction set out by Dr. Russell in his 1750 Latin treatise on the use of seawater for diseases of the glands, immersion in cold seawater, and the measured drinking of minor quantities of it, were believed to cure a long list of complaints, from scrofula to rheumatism to female nervous disorders to the ill effects of urban living. Russell himself died in 1759, but the Brighton he had helped to make continued to grow on the strength of his ideas. By 1788, the medical foundation of the place has become, in some ways, a fading memory, the earlier patients having been replaced by the fashionable summer visitors of the present day, but the rituals he established have remained. The bathing itself, in 1788, is conducted from machines drawn up on the shingle. A bathing machine is a wooden hut on 4 large wheels with a door at each end that can be drawn down into the surf by a horse and then drawn back out when the bather is finished. The bather enters at the landward end, fully dressed. Inside the machine, in a brief enclosed wooden space about the size of a privy, the bather changes into a long bathing dress made of heavy flannel that covers the whole body. The horse then draws the machine into the water until the seaward end is in 3 or 4 feet of surf. At this point, the bather, standing inside the machine, opens the seaward door, descends the faint set of steps into the sea, and is received by the dipper. The dipper is the woman whose job is to assist the bather in actually getting wet. She wades alongside the machine. She holds the bather's hand. She lowers the bather once or more, fully into the cold sea, holding the bather's head under for a count of 3 or so, before raising her again. The bather, having had her dipping, returns up the steps into the machine, dries herself, dresses again, knocks on the wall to signal to the machine operator outside, and is drawn back up the beach to be released onto the shingle. The whole operation takes perhaps 15 minutes from beginning to end. It is a serious, dignified, faintly absurd procedure, conducted on most fine summer mornings by perhaps 50 or 60 fashionable visitors, taking their dipping in turns. The most famous of the Brighton dippers in 1788 is a Sussex woman called Martha Gunn, who has been dipping the female bathers for nearly 3 decades and has become, Because of her presence at the bathing of so many great ladies and the prince's own early visits, a narrow public character in her own right, Martha Gunn is 52 in 1788. She is a heavy-built, weatherproof woman who has the strength to lift a fully grown lady out of the surf with one hand, and the cheerful disposition to make the lady laugh while she is being lifted. The prince has had his own portrait taken with her. She is painted on the Royal Pavilion's commemorative china. She is, in her simple way, one of the mascots of the Brighton summer. She knows Maria. She has dipped her several times. She greets her with the restrained, respectful familiarity of someone who has held her client's head under the surf, knowing the client is a Catholic and the prince's wife and a great lady, and also, beneath all of those things, a woman in a flannel dress, shivering in the cold sea like everyone else. The bathing is the central ritual. Around the bathing, the fashionable Brighton summer has organised itself. The day begins early for the bathers, who usually take their dipping between 7 and 10 in the morning when the tide is right. After the bathing, there is breakfast, usually taken in the lodging or hotel where the visitor is staying. After breakfast, there is the morning's promenade on the Stein, where the visitors walk and meet each other, and conduct the spare social business of seeing and being seen. There is the morning's visit to one of the libraries, of which Brighton has several, where the visitors subscribe and read the London papers, and look at the new books, and conduct further social business. There is lunch. There is the afternoon, which is variously occupied with carriage drives in the country round about, with visits, with sleeping. There is the evening, which usually includes a dinner at home or at someone else's lodging, followed by either an assembly at the Castle Inn or the Old Ship, where there is dancing and cards, or a quieter private evening in the drawing-room of one of the host houses. The whole week is structured around 2 assembly evenings on Mondays and Thursdays, which are the great public events of the Brighton week and which everyone of fashion attends. Maria participates in this round in her own characteristically restrained way. She bathes perhaps once or twice a week in the season, when the weather and her health permit. She walks on the Stein in the mornings. She subscribes to one of the libraries, Mr. Donaldson's, on the south side of the Stein, where she calls in 2 or 3 times a week to read the papers and exchange restrained news with whoever is there. She attends the assemblies occasionally when the company looks agreeable, although she is not an enthusiast for public dancing, and she finds the cards at the assemblies generally more serious than she enjoys. She prefers the modest private dinners and the plain drawing-room evenings in her own house. The prince, by contrast, makes the assemblies whenever he is in town, and is generally the centre of the attention at them, and has a card party at the pavilion most nights of the week that runs into the early hours. The 2 of them keep, in their entertainments, very different rhythms. They meet almost always at the quiet hour in her drawing-room, after his more public events have ended. The town itself, beyond the Stein and the seafront, is minor enough to be walked across in 20 minutes. The medieval lanes of the old fishing village are still there. Behind the seafront, narrow streets of modest houses where the fishing population still live, where the little shops of the town are concentrated, where the fish market is held every morning when the fleet has come in. There are the new streets laid out over the past 2 decades, like North Row where Maria's house is, and West Street where Lady Anne is staying, and the new Marine Parade running east along the cliff top above the sea. There is the old parish church of St. Nicholas on the hill above the town, Anglican and therefore not Maria's church, though she sometimes passes it on her morning walks. There is the brief chapel of the Spanish ambassador's chaplain on West Street, the only Catholic place of worship in the town that is not a private oratory. where Maria occasionally goes when there is a feast day or a preacher she wishes to hear. There are the assembly rooms at the Castle Inn and the Old Ship. There are the libraries. There are the lodging houses where the visitors stay. There are the workshops of the trades that supply them, the milliners and the shoemakers, and the tailors and the wine merchants. There is the great open space of the Stein at the centre of it all, the ground where the fishermen used to dry their nets, now turned into the social centre of the fashionable town, where everything happens and where everyone walks. This is the faintly fashionable, medically founded, royally patronised, busily growing seaside town in which Maria has chosen to spend her summers. She likes it for reasons that all lead back, in the end, to the person she is. She likes that it is narrow. She likes that the rituals are public enough for her position in them not to be constantly negotiated. She can walk on the Stein each morning and be greeted by the people she chooses to greet, in the middle distance of formal acquaintance, without the closer and more demanding obligations of London. The sea air seems genuinely good for her health. Her house is her own, in a way her London house, when the prince is in residence, sometimes is not. The circle of friends who come to Brighton each summer is smaller. Above all, she likes the unhurried late summer light, the long Sussex twilight that begins in late afternoon and runs down through the evening into a clear starlit night. The days here, in their simple fashionable ritual, leave room for her own things, her music, her reading, her devotions, her household, in a way the busier London winter does not. Mrs. Fitzherbert's house is on the eastern side of the Stein, perhaps 250 yards from the pavilion, on a short street called North Row that has been laid out within the last decade. The house is one of a terrace of 4. It is 3 stories high, with a basement, and a spare yard at the back where the kitchen wing extends. It is built of local Sussex brick, painted cream, with white window frames, and a black painted front door with a brass knocker. By the standards of the great London houses or the great country houses, it is a modest dwelling. Maria Fitzherbert's income, which comes from her second husband's estate, is comfortable but not large. She has perhaps £2,000 a year, which in 1788 is enough for a respectable upper gentry life with 7 indoor servants and a coachman, but nothing like the income of the women she dines with at Devonshire House in London. She lives within her means. She has always lived within her means. She has the gentry economy of a Catholic woman who has been twice widowed and has had to manage her own affairs since she was 18, and she has kept that economy even now, when the Prince of Wales is across the road, and would, if she asked, give her any sum she liked. She does not ask. She has never asked. It is one of the things the prince's circle find most peculiar about her, and one of the things the prince himself loves her for. To understand the woman now upstairs being dressed for dinner by Mary Smith, it helps to follow the life that made her, the first 32 years of Catholic gentry habit, restraint, memory, and household discipline that have shaped the texture of this evening. She was born Maria Ann Smythe on the 26th of July 1756 at Tong Castle in Shropshire, the principal seat of the Pierpont family, where her father Walter Smythe was at the time a guest. Her family were Catholic gentry of long standing, Northumberland in their origins, with a baronetcy that her grandfather had held and her uncle now held. The Smythes had kept the old faith through all the difficult centuries since the Reformation, paying the recusancy fines, sending their children abroad to be educated, marrying within the restrained network of English Catholic families who had done the same, maintaining a chapel in the house at Brambridge in Hampshire where her father lived, hearing Mass discreetly with their priests, attending the great Catholic family chapels at Stonor or Wardour or Tichborne when they could, living a life at once entirely English in its country, gentry texture, and separate from the Anglican mainstream around them. Lore. She was the eldest of 6 children. Her childhood was at Brambridge, the Smythe family house in Hampshire, with summers sometimes at Tong with her mother's family or at the houses of Catholic relations. She was educated until she was about 10 by a governess at home who taught her the basic things: reading, writing, French, the catechism, music. At the age of about 10 or 11, she was sent abroad, as Catholic girls of her class still were in this period, to the English convent of the Conceptionists in Paris, in the Rue de Charenton, in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, where she remained into her early adolescence. The English convents in Paris and the Spanish Netherlands were one of the strangest and most poignant institutions of the 18th century English Catholic world. They were communities of English nuns, founded mostly in the 17th century after the Reformation had made convent life impossible in England, who lived in religious houses on the continent, and educated the daughters of English Catholic families, who could not be educated at home without either losing their faith or being forced into expensive private arrangements. There were a dozen or so of these convents in Paris and Bruges and Liege and Louvain, each with its modest school attached, each providing a French or Flemish-flavoured education in piety and polite accomplishments to a few dozen English girls sent over for 2 or 3 years at a time. Maria was in Paris for the stretch between about 11 and 15. She returned speaking perfect French. She returned with a serious and sober Catholic devotion that she would carry for the rest of her life. She returned with the self-possession that French convent education seems to have produced almost as a side effect, the calm bearing of a young woman formed among nuns who did not raise their voices and who had known her well. She came back to England in about 1771, when she was 15, and lived at Brambridge with her family until about 19. There is, in this period, a plain gap in the record. We do not know much about her late teens. She read. She presumably visited cousins. She presumably met young men of her own class at the minor Catholic country gatherings that were the marriage market of her community. But the record does not give us much detail. Before her marriages, though, the Paris convent deserves a little more time, because the interval she spent there from about 1767 to 1771 matters more to the woman she became than the brief biographical mention of it suggests. It gives a flavour to who she would be for the rest of her life. The convent of the Conceptionists in the Rue de Charenton was a community of perhaps 20 English nuns, founded in the 1650s in the long aftermath of the Reformation, when English Catholic religious life had to be conducted abroad, if it was to be conducted at all. The community was self-supporting, partly through the dowries of the women who became nuns, partly through the school fees of the English Catholic girls who were sent over to be educated. The school was modest. There were perhaps 15 or 20 pupils at any given time, ranging in age from about 8 to about 16. The girls slept in a long dormitory with a wooden partition between each bed for privacy. They woke at 6. They attended the morning office and the daily mass at 7. They had breakfast at 7:30. They were in lessons from 8 until 12. They had dinner at noon. They had a short recreation period in the afternoon. They were in lessons again from 2 until 5. They had supper at 6. They attended the evening office at 7. They were in bed by 8. The lessons were a mixture of the things the nuns themselves could teach. French, which was the daily language of the convent. English, which was their own language. Latin, in a basic form, sufficient to follow the Mass and the office. Italian, which several of the older nuns spoke. The catechism, which was the central religious instruction of the school and was taken seriously. Religious history, especially the history of the English Catholic community since the Reformation. with the names of the martyrs and the great recusant families known by heart, sacred music, sung daily, which the girls were taught to sing along with the nuns. Plain music in the secular sense, on the harpsichord that the convent kept for the purpose, drawing and watercolour painting in a basic form. Needlework in the forms then expected of a young lady, plain sewing for the household linen, fine embroidery for ornamental work, lace-making in the French style. There were no boys. There were no men in the school side of the convent. There were almost no books that were not religious. There was, by design, an enclosed female intellectual world built around the daily round of prayer and study and companionable restraint. For Maria, who entered this world at the age of about 10 or 11 and left it at 15, this was the formative period of her education, and the texture of the convent shaped the texture of her adult life in ways that lasted until she died. The measured daily rhythm of the office, the Latin that she had learned to follow as a girl, the serious religious observance that was simply part of the structure of the day, the female companionship that did not require explanation, the repeated work of the needle, the composed manners, the habit of reading with attention rather than quickly and lightly, the bilingual French and English that she carried from that place and would never lose, the Italian she had picked up from the older nuns, the kind of devotional disposition, neither showy nor doubting, that French Catholic education in particular produced, the slight French inflection of her piety, which was quieter and more interior than the more boisterous Italian or Spanish styles of Catholic devotion, and which suited her temperament perfectly. All of this came from the convent, and there was, in addition to the formal education, a slow informal influence on character that the convent worked. The English nuns of the Conceptionists were, almost without exception, the daughters of English Catholic gentry families who had taken the veil in their 20s because they had felt the call, or because there had been no marriage forthcoming, or because they had wanted, for whatever reason, to live the religious life. They were, in their personal stories, not unlike the kind of woman that Maria herself might have become if her circumstances had been slightly different. They were intelligent, they were educated, they were, many of them, witty in a careful French way that English convent education seemed to produce. They were not, in the popular Protestant imagination of nuns, suppressed or sad. They were, mostly, contented women, living in the narrow, enclosed world they had chosen, doing the work they had chosen, in the company of women they had known for many years. They were, in their way, models of a form of female adult life that Maria absorbed without ever consciously deciding to. While she was at the convent, she was especially close to one nun, Mother Mary Magdalene Whittam, who had been the prioress when Maria arrived, and who continued to take a personal interest in her education. Mother Whittam was in her 60s when Maria knew her, the daughter of a Lancashire Catholic family who had entered the convent in the 1720s and had been there for over 4 decades by the time Maria came to her. By all the accounts that survive of her in the convent's records, she was a woman of unusual sense and warmth. She corresponded with Maria long after Maria left the convent, until her own death in 1779. The letters do not survive, but the fact of the correspondence is recorded in the convent's books. Maria, when she heard of Mother Whittam's death, had a mass said for her at her own private chapel in London, and gave a sum of money to the convent for the maintenance of the simple chapel where the prioress had said her morning prayers. At Zia and Sidon, this was the human texture of Paris, a narrow enclosed world of female intelligence and devotion, a measured formation of character, a model of dignified Catholic adult life lived without anxiety in the company of others, a religious practice that was serious but not overwrought, a bilingual French-English culture that gave her, for the rest of her life, access to the French religious and literary world that the merely English-educated women of her class did not have. She emerged at 15 with all of this in her, mostly without being able to articulate it, because the deepest formations rarely announce themselves. She came back to Brambrige in 1771, not as a finished adult, but with the foundation of the adult she would become already laid. It is worth saying, also, that the Paris education gave her a European cosmopolitan quality that biographies sometimes miss. Maria was not, despite her reserve and her domestic preferences, a parochial woman. She had lived in a foreign capital as a child. She knew Paris. She knew French Catholic culture. She read Madame de Sévigné and Madame de Genlis and the French translations of the great Italian devotional writers. She had, throughout her life, a French inflection to her religious life and her literary life that her purely English-educated contemporaries lacked. Her later flight to the continent in 1784 to escape the prince's pursuit was, in this sense, a return to an environment she already knew. She knew where to go. She knew the convents that would receive her. She knew the cities where one could live discreetly. She had a French education to draw on. The reflex of going abroad when she needed to be safe was in part one of the reflexes the convent had given her. The next thing we know with certainty about her is that, in the summer of 1775, just before her 19th birthday, she was married to Edward Weld of Lulworth Castle in Dorset, a Catholic landowner of considerable property who was 44 to her 18. This first marriage was the sort of marriage the restrained English Catholic gentry made because the modest English Catholic gentry could only marry within itself, and the suitable men within itself were not always of suitable age. Weld was a widower. His first wife, Juliana Petre, had died several years before. He was lonely, wealthy, eligible by the standards of the closed Catholic marriage market. He had property, he had connections, he had a great house at Lulworth on the Dorset coast. That was one of the principal Catholic country houses of the south of England. The marriage was arranged, with the consent of both families, in the spring of 1775. Maria was 18. She had not been in love. She had been told that this was a good and suitable match, and she accepted it as such, as young women of her class and her religion had been accepting such matches for a very long time. The marriage lasted 3 months. Edward Weld died on the 26th of October 1775 of injuries sustained when his horse fell with him while he was out riding on his estate. He had not yet altered his will to provide for his new wife. The previous will, written before the marriage, left everything to his younger brother Thomas. Maria, at 19, was a widow. She was technically entitled to a widow's portion under English law, but the Weld family disputed this, and rather than fighting them, she accepted a plain settlement and went home to Brambrige. She had been married for less than 4 months. She had been 18 when she married, and was 19 when she was widowed. She had no children. She had almost no money of her own. She returned to her father's house and resumed, as best she could, the life of a daughter of the family. For the next 3 years she stayed at home. We have, again, almost no record of this period of her life. She was 19, then 20, then 21. She had been a wife. She had been a widow. She had, by the standards of the minor Catholic gentry, very little prospect of a second marriage that would suit her. The Weld marriage had been a perfectly respectable arrangement, but the circumstances of its end, the disputed will, the brief duration, the absence of children, had left her in an awkward social position, neither maiden nor proper widow. With a little income, and no clear future. She read, "She did the things daughters of country families did. She visited relations. She presumably tried to make sense of what had happened to her at 18 and what was now to become of her. In 1778, when she was 22, she met and married Thomas Fitzherbert of Swinnerton Hall in Staffordshire. This was a much more equal match than the first. Thomas Fitzherbert was 30, only 8 years her senior. He was a Catholic of an old recusant family. He was wealthy, with property in Staffordshire and a London house in Park Street, Mayfair. He was, by all accounts, a serious and good man, devoted to her, intelligent, of mild temper. The marriage took place in June of 1778. Maria became Mrs. Fitzherbert. She moved with her husband between Swinnerton in the summer and London in the winter. She was, for a time, settled into the life she had been raised to expect. The marriage lasted until 1781. In June of 1780, the Gordon riots broke out in London. These were the great anti-Catholic riots that erupted after the Catholic Relief Act of 1778, the act that had given Catholics in England their first significant legal toleration in 2 centuries. A mob led by the unbalanced Lord George Gordon attacked Catholic chapels and the houses of prominent Catholics across London, burning the Sardinian and Bavarian embassy chapels, attacking Newgate Prison, threatening the Bank of England. The riots lasted nearly a week. Several hundred people were killed. Catholic property across London was destroyed. Thomas Fitzherbert, who had been at his London house through the riots, took an active part in defending Catholic property and persons during those days, with consequences for his health that became apparent in the months afterward. Whether the exposure to the smoke and the violence of the riots was the cause, or whether he had been ill before, the record is not clear. But by 1781 his health was declining seriously. The doctors recommended a continental winter for the air. As the colder months came on, he went to the south of France with Maria. He died at Nice on the 7th of May 1781 of consumption or of a related lung complaint. He was 33. Maria, at 25, was a widow for the second time. This time, however, the will was in order. Thomas Fitzherbert had provided for her with care and intelligence. She was left with a London house in Park Street in Mayfair and a clear annuity of £2,000 a year from the Fitzherbert estate. The Staffordshire property went, as Catholic family property of this kind generally did, to a male relative of the Fitzherbert line, but Maria was not left to depend on that family. She had her own income, settled on her by her husband's marriage settlement and his will. She was financially independent, as a woman of her class and period rarely was. She was 25, twice widowed, attractive, intelligent, financially comfortable, with a London house of her own and the freedom to live as she chose. She came back to England in the autumn of 1781, took up residence at Park Street, and began to organise her own life. From 1781 to 1784, she lived in London as a respectable young Catholic widow with her own establishment. She was received in the better Catholic society. She was also gradually taken up by some Whig hostesses, especially the Duchess of Devonshire and her circle, who admired her beauty, her serious manner, and her composed good sense. She went to the opera. She went to Almack's, where her reserved dignity was noted. She was painted by Gainsborough and Reynolds. She was, in the brief gossipy world of fashionable London, a known figure, but one of unimpeachable reputation, the sort of young widow whose discretion and intelligence had set her apart. She was not a woman who had ever attracted scandal. She had been twice married, twice widowed, and had conducted herself through all of it with a self-possession that everyone who met her remarked on. The Whig hostess world that took her up in this period is worth describing briefly, because it shaped the social context in which she would later be received as the prince's wife, and because it gives a picture of the bright, intense world of fashionable London in the 1780s. The centre of it was Devonshire House, the great London townhouse of the 5th Duke of Devonshire and his wife Georgiana, the famous Duchess. Georgiana, who was 3 years younger than Maria, was the most celebrated political hostess of her generation. She had married the Duke at 17, had been a leader of fashion since her late teens, had become an active Whig political organiser in the early 1780s, and had built up around herself and her sister Lady Bessborough a circle of women friends and male political allies who constituted, in 1783 and 1784, the inner sociable world of the parliamentary Whig opposition. Georgiana was charming, generous, beautiful, perpetually in debt, deeply unhappy in some ways behind the public charm, and personally responsive to other women, as genuinely sociable women often are. She took up Maria in late 1782 or early 1783, with the swift, generous interest she gave to most things that caught her attention, and made a point of including her in the smaller dinners at Devonshire House, where the conversation was political, but the company was personal. Through Georgiana, Maria came to know the wider circle. Lady Bessborough, the Duchess's sister, who was Maria's age, and who became, in time, one of Maria's closer friends. Lady Melbourne, the great Whig political hostess at Melbourne House, who was sharper than Georgiana and considerably more cynical, and who watched Maria with a cooler eye but never directly attacked her. Mrs. Sheridan, the wife of the playwright and Whig politician, a beautiful, mild-tempered Irish woman whom Maria liked. The painter Joshua Reynolds, the dramatist Sheridan himself, Charles James Fox, the great Whig politician, who would later be the central figure in the political crisis of 1787, the young Earl of Carlisle, the other men and women who composed the Whig social world. This was not a world in which Maria was naturally at home, and this needs to be understood. The Whig hostess set was, by the standards of Maria's Catholic gentry upbringing, a fast set. The women drank more than Maria drank. The conversation was more openly political than was usual in Catholic circles. There were public love affairs that Maria's own world did not have. There was a cheerful hostility to the king and the court that Maria, who was not notably political, and who had a residual loyalty to the institution of the throne, did not entirely share. There was, above all, a sense of being a defined social set in opposition to the rest of the world, a feeling of in-group identity that the narrow private Catholic gentry world had never had, because the Catholic world was too plain and too embattled to define itself by what it opposed. Maria, in the Whig set, was therefore something of an outsider, and the Whigs were aware of this. She was not, as Lady Melbourne was a Whig, or Lady Bessborough was a Whig, one of theirs. She was a reserved, somewhat older, religiously serious Catholic woman, whom they had taken up because they liked her. She was, in their company, herself, and they took her on those terms. The arrangement worked because both sides understood it. Maria did not pretend to be a Whig. The Whigs did not pretend that she was one of them. They simply included her, with the affection that the genuinely sociable extend to people they like, even when those people are not quite like themselves. The connection mattered afterward in two ways. First, it gave Maria a London social home that was independent of the Catholic gentry network, and meant that her life was not entirely confined to her co-religionists, which would have been unusual for a Catholic widow of her time. Second, and more importantly, it placed her, when the Prince of Wales noticed her in 1784, in the social orbit of his own circle. The prince was a Whig by inheritance and by inclination, and the Whig set was his set. Devonshire House was his second home. Georgiana was his confidant. Fox was his political mentor. When he saw Maria at the opera and asked who she was, the answer that came back was the answer of a woman whom his own friends already knew, whom his own circle already approved of, whose introduction to him would not require any awkward explanation of where she had come from. She was, by 1784, already inside the world he himself moved in. The pursuit that followed, and the marriage that eventually came of it, were possible, in part because the Whig set had taken her up in 1782 and 1783, and had made her one of the people whom the prince would naturally meet. So there is one more thing worth noting about her London life before the prince entered it. She was in this period painted twice by Joshua Reynolds, and once, in pastel, by Gainsborough. The Reynolds portraits, both done in 1782 or 1783, show a young woman in her late 20s of striking but reserved good looks, with fair hair worn high in the fashion of the 1780s, with serious grey-blue eyes, and with a slightly long face that the painter has caught in the spare, reflective expression that contemporaries thought characteristic of her. Reynolds painted hundreds of fashionable women in this period. Maria was, in his record, one of the more memorable of them, not for any single dramatic feature, but for the quality of inwardness that he managed to put on the canvas. The portraits hang now in private collections. They show a face that almost no other source captures with comparable accuracy. The face of a woman who is being looked at while she is in fact looking at something inside her own mind. That was Maria, in the interval between her second widowhood and the prince's pursuit. As an attentive observer saw her, it was in the spring of 1784, when she was 28, that she met the Prince of Wales for the first time. He saw her at the opera. He asked who she was. He was told. He pursued her in the way that he pursued everything, with an intensity that she found, at first, simply embarrassing, and then, as it persisted, alarming. She did not encourage him, she actively discouraged him. He was 22. She was the elder by 6. He was the heir to the throne. She was a respectable Catholic widow whose social position, however carefully held, depended on her not becoming the object of public scandal. She fled to the continent in the summer of 1784 to escape him. She stayed away for more than 12 months, moving between Paris and the Low Countries, hoping he would forget her. He did not forget her. He sent emissaries. He wrote letters in his enormous looping hand that arrived in the towns where she was staying. On one celebrated occasion, he stabbed himself, or appeared to stab himself, in the chest, and his ministers and friends came to her at her continental addresses, begging her to return to England, telling her that if she did not the heir to the throne would die, that the political situation of the kingdom required her to come back, that no other course would save him. She came back eventually, in late 1785. She returned, having made her conditions. She would not be his mistress. She would not be ruined. She would only return on the basis of marriage. He agreed. The marriage took place in her drawing room at Park Street on the 15th of December 1785, conducted by a Church of England clergyman called Robert Burt, in the presence of her uncle Henry Errington and her brother John Smythe, with no one else present. In the eyes of the Catholic Church, the ceremony was valid. In Anglican form, it was valid as well. Under English law, however, it was void on 2 separate grounds. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772, passed by King George III to prevent his children from marrying without his consent, made any marriage of a member of the royal family under 25 void without the king's permission, which had not been sought and would not have been given. The Act of Settlement of 1701, the constitutional foundation of the Hanoverian succession, made marriage to a Catholic by a person in the line of succession a complete bar to that succession. The Prince of Wales had, in marrying Maria Fitzherbert, both married without his father's consent and married a Catholic. The marriage was, in English law, no marriage at all. In her own conscience, however, and in the eyes of the Catholic Church, to which she would later appeal for a ruling, it was the only valid marriage she had ever contracted to a man of her own age and choice. That was almost 3 Decembers ago, on the night I am now describing. She has been, by her own understanding, the wife of the heir to the throne for 2 years and 8 months. She has been treated, by the prince's friends and by the Whig aristocracy who form his political circle, as if she were his wife. She has not been received at court, of course, and never will be. The king will not acknowledge her, and the queen still less. But she has been received almost everywhere else. She has, in 1787, been through the most difficult crisis of the marriage so far, when the prince's debts were to be addressed in Parliament, and his Whig allies, Charles James Fox and Sheridan, had to manage the political problem of his secret marriage. Fox stood up in the Commons in April of 1787 and denied the marriage absolutely, in language that left no room for ambiguity, on the grounds that to admit it would be to bar the prince from the succession and constitute a constitutional crisis. Maria heard of the denial through the press the next morning. She was, she said later, more deeply wounded than by any other thing in her life. She nearly left the prince. He came to her, distraught, and explained that Fox had denied the marriage without his consent, that he had not authorized the denial, that he was as horrified as she. She did not believe him entirely, but she did not want to believe him entirely the worst, and after several weeks Sheridan was sent into the Commons with a more ambiguous statement that softened the absolute denial and allowed her to remain technically intact in her position. The crisis passed. They reconciled. But it had left a mark on her that would never quite go away. She knew now, in a way she had not quite known before, that her position was not as settled as it had felt in the first 18 months of the marriage. She knew that the political pressure on him would always, ultimately, override the private commitment to her. She knew that there would, at some point, be a crisis that he could not manage with a Sheridan amendment. She did not know when it would come. She knew it would come, but it has not come yet. It is still 1788. The Fox denial is over a year past. The marriage, for the past year and a half, settled into a kind of quiet domestic stability that has surprised even her. He comes to her almost every evening when they are in the same town. He treats her, in private, as his wife. He defers to her judgment on a great many things. He has brought a kind of stability to her life that she had not had since her second widowhood. She has brought, in the view of his own friends and family, a stabilizing influence to him that nothing else in his life has provided. The Whig hostesses who watch them both consider her a steadying force. The Tory establishment, which loathes everything about the prince, makes a quiet exception for her on the grounds that she is at least a decent woman who has improved his behaviour. She has, in 1788, achieved a kind of fragile public position that has the appearance of permanence, even though, underneath, she knows that the appearance is only an appearance. This is the woman who is now, at 5:30, on a late August evening in 1788, in her first-floor bedroom at her house on North Row, being dressed for dinner by Mary Smith, who has been with her since 1781, and who is, in a quiet way, one of the most important people in her life. Let me take you upstairs. The bedroom is at the back of the first floor, looking south towards the sea, which can be seen as a thin grey line beyond the rooftops of the houses on the south side of the street. It is not a large room. It is perhaps 18 feet by 15, with a window in the south wall, a fireplace in the east wall, the door in the west, and the bed against the north. The bed is a four-poster of mahogany with pale green hangings set against a wall papered in a pattern of restrained green leaves on a cream ground. The fireplace is white marble, simple, with a low fire burning in it now, against the slight chill that has come into the air with the late August evening. Even though the day has been warm, the carpet is a pale green and cream, English-made, of the kind that was being woven in Wilton in the 1780s. The chest of drawers is mahogany. The dressing table sits between the windows with its own glass and its modest array of the things she uses each evening. There is a low chair near the fireplace where Mary Smith sits when she is waiting. There is a writing desk in one corner where Maria sometimes writes letters in for the morning before she comes downstairs. There is a plain cabinet against one wall in which she keeps her jewellery and her private papers. The room is hers. It looks like her. It is decorated in the pale, restrained, French-inflected taste that she developed in her Paris convent days and has carried as her personal style ever since. The colours are subdued. The fabrics are good but not showy. There is nothing in the room that would suggest the woman who lives in it is the secret wife of the heir to the throne. There is nothing that would suggest she has any connection to the pavilion across the Stein. The room belongs in every visible way to a respectable, well-bred, devout Catholic widow who has cultivated, by the age of 32, a distinct taste for plain things, and who lives among them with the comfort of someone who has chosen each one with attention. Mary Smith is 26. She is the daughter of a Catholic farmer in Hampshire who had worked land near the Smythe family seat at Brambridge. She came into Maria's service in 1781 as a young housemaid, was promoted to lady's maid before Maria's secret marriage to the prince, and has been with her ever since. She is, after her uncle Henry Errington, the person Maria has known longest and most steadily in the world. She knows everything. She was at Park Street on the night of the secret wedding in 1785. She helped Maria into the dress she wore for the ceremony. She held Maria's hand in the carriage afterwards. She is, in the formal language of the household, Mrs. Fitzherbert's lady's maid. In a less formal language, she is Maria's friend, her confidant, the minor steady human presence at the centre of Maria's domestic life. She is unmarried. She has no plans to marry. She is paid £25 a year, which is high for the period, plus her food and lodging, and her mistress's discarded clothes. The arrangement suits both of them. It will continue, in fact, for another 4 decades. Mary Smith will still be with Maria when Maria dies in 1837. She will be an old woman herself by that point, having spent nearly her entire adult life in this single service. She will be one of the very few people Maria mentions by name in her will. The dressing for dinner takes about 40 minutes. Maria stands or sits as Mary moves around her, doing the little, slow, careful tasks of dressing. The undergarments are arranged. The corset is laced gently to the moderate degree of tightness that Maria has always preferred. The petticoat is put on. The dress, which has been laid out on the bed, is lifted and put over Maria's head, settled on her shoulders, hooked at the back. The dress is one of Maria's quieter ones, a pale silk of a soft grey-blue colour, with a modest neckline and three-quarter sleeves edged in fine lace. It is the kind of dress a respectable widow wears for dinner at home with friends. It is not designed to attract attention. The hair, which Mary has been working at for 15 minutes already, is finished now, dressed in the quieter version of the late 1780s style, rolled back from the forehead, but not powdered, not built up to the great heights of court fashion, with a single simple feather pinned at the side of the head in a way that adds a brief note of evening, but does not announce itself. 2 faint pearl earrings, a single string of narrow pearls at the throat, a simple gold cross on a chain, which Maria wears against her skin under the dress, and which only she and Mary know is there. When the dressing is complete, Maria stands at the glass for a moment, considers herself, and gives Mary the simple nod that means thank you and we are finished. Mary tidies the dressing table, folds the discarded clothes into a basket, and leaves the room with the basket. Maria goes to the writing desk, takes out a small leather-bound book, makes a brief note in it, returns the book to the desk, and prepares to go downstairs. The book is her household book, in which she keeps spare daily notes of expenditure and of restrained reminders to herself. She writes in it most evenings before dinner. The note tonight is brief. She has reminded herself that she needs to write to her sister Frances in London about a modest matter to do with their mother's health. Before she goes down, she makes the plain private gesture that is her own. In this house, at the end of dressing, she steps into the minor adjoining room that connects her bedroom with the chapel beyond. The chapel is the central religious fact of her household. It is a little upstairs room, perhaps 12 feet by 10, on the same floor as her bedroom, originally intended as a dressing room, that she has converted into her private oratory. It has a brief altar against the east wall, with a crucifix above and 2 candles in silver holders. There is a faint kneeling bench in front of the altar, with a velvet cushion. There is a single chair against the north wall. There is a narrow case containing the vestments and the chalice and the missal, which Father Hutton uses at the daily Mass. The walls are bare except for a simple painting of the Virgin and Child that her mother gave her at the time of her first marriage, and that has accompanied her through every house she has lived in since the room is quiet. There is no fire here. The candles are not lit. The light is the soft late afternoon light from the narrow window in the west wall. Maria goes to the kneeling bench and kneels for perhaps 3 minutes. She is not saying any particular prayer. She is doing the thing she has done in some version every evening of her adult life, which is the spare pause of attention before the social demands of the evening begin. The Catholic life, in 1788, is structured around restrained regular returns to attention of this kind. The morning Mass, the grace before meals, the evening prayers, the brief stop in the chapel before going down, the act of remembering oneself briefly before being absorbed back into the social. She stands, crosses herself, and leaves the chapel. She walks to the staircase. She goes down to the drawing room. Let me tell you about the rest of the house. The house on North Row is, as I said, modest by the standards of the great houses of the period. It is a comfortable upper gentry house in a fashionable seaside town. It has on the ground floor a modest entrance hall, a dining room to the right of the hall, a drawing room to the left of the hall, and a library at the back. The library, which is also where her uncle has been working this afternoon, has windows looking onto the plain back garden and the minor enclosed yard where the kitchen wing extends. The kitchen, the scullery, and the servants' working rooms are in a single-story extension at the back of the house, with a separate entrance from the yard. There is a little basement under the front of the house that is used for the wine cellar and for general storage. On the first floor, there are the principal bedroom, which is Maria's, the dressing room next to it, the brief chapel that opens off the dressing room, and a guest bedroom which her uncle is currently occupying. On the second floor there are 3 smaller bedrooms used by the senior servants and a sewing room. In the attic, under the roof, there are 2 more faint bedrooms used by the junior servants. The drawing room which Maria now enters is the principal reception room of the house. It is perhaps 25 feet long by 18 wide, with 2 tall windows facing east towards the sea, although the view of the sea is partly blocked by the houses across the street. The walls are papered in pale yellow with a fine cream-coloured stripe. The carpet is a French aubusson, woven in the same period as the carpet upstairs and matching it in tone, that she had bought in Paris when she was abroad in 1784 and 1785, escaping the prince's pursuit. The furniture is mahogany, English-made, of the lighter style that came in during the 1780s, with cane backs and pale silk seats. There are 2 sofas, 4 armchairs, several side tables, a narrow writing table near one window, a square card table folded against one wall. There is a 6-year-old broadwood pianoforte against the far wall, with a simple stack of music on top of it. There is a marble fireplace, white, with a low fire burning. There is a portrait of her mother, painted when her mother was a young woman, hanging above the mantel. There is a modest portrait of Thomas Fitzherbert, painted in 1778, hanging on the side wall in a spare oval frame, where she can see it from her usual chair. The room is comfortable, intimate, female in its overall tone. The drawing room a Catholic widow of taste keeps, a room in which serious conversation can take place without ever feeling formal. The prince, when he comes here, has remarked more than once that he prefers this drawing room to any of the rooms in the pavilion. Maria has noted his remark privately as another instance of his habit of flattering, which she has learned since 1785 to discount when she hears it, although she also believes there is some truth in it. The pavilion, in 1788, is a house full of expensive things that the prince has been buying for it without much overall plan, with the result that the rooms are crowded and not entirely connected to one another. Her drawing room is the opposite. It is a room of considered, modest, coherent choices. In its restrained way, it is a relief from the chaos of his establishment. The library, behind the drawing room, is a compact room, perhaps 15 feet square, lined with books on 3 walls, with a window onto the garden. There is a desk in the centre, where her Uncle Henry has been at work this afternoon. There is a leather-covered sofa under the window. There is a pair of comfortable armchairs near the fire. The books are a respectable working library. Theology, both Catholic and Protestant, the Catholic in greater quantity. History, the classics in translation, with a few volumes in the original Latin that her uncle reads more than she does. English literature, a run of the standard reference works, a Johnson's Dictionary, a Brooks's Gazetteer, the most recent volumes of the Annual Register. Some French books, novels and devotional works in modest quantities. The library is not a great library. It is the working library of a family that reads with attention but not display. There are perhaps 400 volumes in total. The dining room, on the other side of the hall, is plainer than the drawing room. It is decorated in a deeper red, with a mahogany table that can seat 10 and that tonight is set for 4. There is a sideboard with the household plate. There is a portrait of her uncle Henry Errington, painted in the 1770s, hanging on the wall opposite the fireplace. A portrait Maria is fond of, and that her uncle privately considers flattering of him in his 30s, when he was already not as handsome as the portrait suggests. The kitchen wing, behind the house, is the working heart of the establishment. It contains the kitchen itself, a stone-flagged room with a wide brick range and a great hearth, where the cook, Mrs. Bridget Kerr, presides. Mrs. Kerr is 48, Irish Catholic, the widow of a London cabinet maker who came into Maria's service in 1782 and has been the household cook ever since. She has a plain kitchen maid called Sarah and a scullery maid called Eliza working under her. There is a separate scullery for the washing up, a larder for cold storage, a still room where the household preserves and cordials are made, and a servants' hall where the indoor servants take their meals. There's a back stair that runs up from the kitchen wing to the upper floors of the house. There is a door from the scullery into the yard where the deliveries arrive. The household consists in total of 8 people: Mary Smith, the lady's maid; Mrs. Kerr, the cook; Sarah and Eliza, the kitchen and scullery maids; a footman called Thomas Walsh, who is 26, also Irish Catholic, who waits at table and does the heavier indoor work; a housemaid called Margaret, who does the cleaning; a coachman called John Davies, who lives in a modest room above the stables 100 yards away on a back lane, and who looks after the carriage and the 2 horses; and in addition the chaplain, Father William Hutton, who is currently 53, who has been with Maria since 1786, who has the upstairs guest bedroom when her uncle is not staying, and who is, although technically not a servant, paid by Maria and considered part of the household. He says daily Mass in the chapel for whichever of the household wishes to attend. He instructs Maria's spiritual life. He is, like all Catholic priests in England in this period, technically vulnerable under old penal laws that are not enforced but have not been repealed. He keeps a low profile. He wears plain dark clothes when he goes out. He is taken by the people of Brighton who see him for some sort of family chaplain or gentleman companion, which is what Catholic priests in private service generally were considered to be at this time. The Catholic Relief Act of 1791 is still in the future. After that act, his position will be more secure, but even now, in 1788, he is in no real danger. The toleration that has come in since 1778 is, in practice, almost complete for a domestic chaplain in a respectable household. He says his Mass, he reads his office, he attends to his little flock. He is, in his reserved way, an extremely well-educated and cultivated man, having been trained at the English College at Douai, where his 12-year course preceded ordination in 1762. He speaks French and Latin. He knows a great deal about church music. He is one of Maria's closest companions in the house. Their relationship is the formal one of priest and penitent in the spiritual order. It is also, in the social order of the household, the relationship of a woman of 32 and an older man of 53 who have lived under the same roof since 1786 and who like each other. This is the household. It is a modest establishment by the standards of the great houses she might have entered as Mrs. Fitzherbert if Thomas had lived, or as the prince's wife, if their marriage had been recognised by the law and the church and the world. It is a perfectly suitable establishment for a respectable widow with £2,000 annually. She runs it with care. She knows each of the servants. She is not generous in any showy way, but she is unfailingly fair, and she is generous in the practical ways that matter to people in service. The simple kindnesses, the remembered birthdays, the gifts at Christmas, the visits when somebody is ill, the household stays. Mary Smith and Mrs. Kerr have been with her for over a decade each. Thomas Walsh has been with her since 1784. The household is a small, steady world that runs on her presence and her attention, and that is, in its spare way, one of the things she has built. I want to pause here before we go on to the day and say a little about what being a Catholic in 1788 actually meant in the texture of Maria's life, because it is one of the things that contemporary readers can most easily underestimate, and because it is one of the things that most clearly differentiated her from almost everyone else in the social world the Prince had pulled her into. The Catholic community in England in 1788 was restrained. Estimates of its size in this period vary, but most historians put it at around 80,000 people, in a total population of about 8 million. That is 1% of the country. The community was not evenly distributed. It was concentrated in the north of England, particularly in Lancashire and parts of Yorkshire and the northeast, where certain old Catholic gentry families had managed to maintain themselves and their tenants in the old religion through the long centuries of penal law. It was also present in pockets in the Midlands and the South, particularly around the great Catholic country houses, like the Welds at Lulworth in Dorset, where Maria's first husband had lived, the Petres at Thorndon in Essex, the Arundels at Wardour in Wiltshire, the Stoners at Stoner in Oxfordshire. In London, there was a Catholic community based around the chapels of the Catholic embassies, the Sardinian and the Bavarian and the Spanish, which had been the only legal Catholic places of public worship in the country for over a century. Catholic life in this modest community was structured by a long series of legal restrictions that by 1788 had been partially relaxed but not removed. The Catholic Relief Act of 1778, passed at the urging of the War Ministry, which wanted to recruit Irish Catholic soldiers for the American War, had given Catholics the right to inherit and purchase land, had relieved their priests of the threat of life imprisonment, and had made it possible to teach in Catholic schools without prosecution. But Catholics were still excluded from voting in parliamentary elections, from holding any office under the Crown, from sitting in either House of Parliament, from practising at the bar, from attending Oxford and Cambridge. They were excluded from the army and navy as commissioned officers, although they could enlist as soldiers. They were excluded from the magistracy. They could not be married validly without going through an Anglican ceremony in addition to whatever Catholic ceremony they preferred. The Act of Settlement of 1701, the constitutional foundation of the Hanoverian succession, made any heir to the throne who married a Catholic forfeit the succession, which was the legal basis of one of the two reasons Maria's marriage to the prince was void in English law. Beneath the legal restrictions, there was the long social fact of Catholic separation that had been built up over 2.5 centuries since the Reformation. Catholic families had married Catholic families. Their children had been educated in Catholic convents and seminaries abroad. Their priests had been trained at the English college at Douai or at Rome or at Valladolid in Spain. They had heard Mass in private chapels in country houses. They had buried their dead in the parish churchyards because there was nowhere else to bury them. But the Mass for the dead was said in the family chapel rather than at the Anglican grave. They had, in some sense, lived a parallel life inside the larger Protestant English society, related to it at every social and economic level, but distinct from it in religion and self-understanding. Maria had been raised entirely inside this parallel community. Her family at Brambridge was Catholic. Her education at the Paris convent had been Catholic. Her first husband had been Catholic. Her second husband had been Catholic. Her uncle Henry Errington was Catholic. Her chaplain Father Hutton was Catholic. Her cook, Mrs. Kerr, and her footman Thomas Walsh, and her kitchen maid Sarah were Catholic, having been chosen by Maria from among the plain Catholic servant population of London, partly because she preferred to employ co-religionists when she could. Her closest friends in the older Catholic gentry sense were Catholic. Her charitable work was Catholic, directed at Catholic widows and Catholic orphans and Catholic schools. Her religious practice was Catholic, conducted daily in her own chapel. What was distinctive about Maria's particular life, as compared with the lives of most other Catholic women of her class, was that the marriage to the prince in 1785 had pulled her for the first time into a wider Protestant social world. Most Catholic women of her class never moved outside the Catholic gentry network. They married within it. They lived within it. They saw their Protestant neighbours only in the formal exchanges of country life, the calls and the dinners that were mandated by gentry social custom. But that did not produce intimate friendships across the religious divide. They did not, like Maria, have their primary social life among Whig hostesses at Devonshire House or evening visitors at the Marine Pavilion. The prince had pulled her, in marrying her, into a social world that was not her own, and the navigation of that world while remaining, in her own conscience, fundamentally Catholic, was one of the minor daily projects of her adult life. She managed it, by 1788, with great skill. The morning mass anchored each day. The chapel upstairs was the religious centre of the house. The chaplain in residence kept the daily liturgical life going. The reading was substantially religious. The charities were Catholic. The adopted children, when they came in the next decade, would be raised Catholic. The friends from the Catholic gentry, like her Uncle Henry, were always coming to stay. The household, as I have said, was substantially Catholic in its lower levels. At the same time, she was a friend of the Duchess of Devonshire and Lady Anne Lindsay and the wider Whig set, all Anglican or sceptical or otherwise outside her religious community. She was painted by Reynolds, who was Anglican. She was, in her social personality, a quiet but full participant in the fashionable social world of late 18th century London and Brighton. The two layers of her life, the inner Catholic religious one and the outer fashionable Protestant social one, did not conflict in her own consciousness. They were both who she was. She moved between them with the kind of practised ease that the long-divided English Catholic community had developed over the centuries as its central social skill. The Catholic gentry had always lived this kind of dual life, presenting an English country face to their Protestant neighbours and a Catholic face to their co-religionists. Maria simply did this on a wider stage than most of them, with a more complicated outer life because of the prince, but with the same inner anchor as her cousins at Brambridge. The marriage to the prince had in fact been one of the things that her Catholicism had given her the resources to do. The marriage was, in English civil law, void. In the Catholic Church, however, it was a true marriage, valid in the sacramental sense, contracted between two free persons before a Christian minister, with the Catholic conditions of mutual consent and the proper form. Maria, who was a serious Catholic, took this sacramental fact as the ground of her position. She was, in her conscience, married. The civil law of England considered her unmarried. The disagreement between the two judgments was, for her, not a problem. She lived inside the Catholic understanding. She did not need the English law to confirm what the Church had blessed. The 1799 papal ruling, which we will come to, was the formal Roman acknowledgement of what she had always understood. But she had not needed the formal acknowledgement to be sure of it. She had been sure of it from the night of the wedding in 1785. This is, I think, the deepest religious texture of her life, and it is one that secular biographies sometimes miss. Maria was not a tortured woman trying to reconcile a religious commitment with an adulterous relationship. She was a Catholic woman who considered herself married, by the Church's standards, to the man she had married before the Church's minister. The English law's contrary judgment was a matter of inconvenience, not of conscience. She lived inside her own sacramental understanding of her position with absolute clarity. The clarity was one of the things that made her, through the next 4.5 decades, so impervious to the social and political crises that washed over her. She knew who she was. The Church had told her. That was sufficient. This was the religious context of the household at North Row. The Mass at 7 each morning, the chapel upstairs with its little altar and its single painting. The chaplain reading his office in the afternoons, the Latin prayers each evening before bed, the serious Catholic life conducted in the upper rooms of the modest house, while the fashionable Brighton summer rolled on outside, with the Prince's card party at the pavilion and the assembly evenings at the Castle Inn and the bathing machines on the beach. The two worlds were both real, and both were Maria's, and she lived in each of them with the practised composure of a woman who had been raised to live in both at once. Now, before dinner, the day that this evening closes comes back into view. The household had risen, as on every morning when she was in residence, at the usual hours. Sarah, the kitchen maid, was up first at 5:30, lighting the kitchen fire and starting the kettle. Margaret, the housemaid, was up at 6, bringing in coal, lighting the fires in the morning room and the dining room. Mrs. Kerr was in the kitchen by 6:30. Thomas Walsh was up at 7, polishing the boots and the silver. Mary Smith was up by 7:30, going downstairs to fetch washing water for her mistress. Father Hutton was up at 6, having said his private morning office, before going down to the chapel to prepare for the 7 o'clock Mass. The Mass that begins each day in the Fitzherbert household is one of the ordinary unrecorded acts of Maria's life that gives the most direct picture of who she was. It happens in the plain upstairs chapel described earlier. It is heard by Maria, by Mary Smith, by Mrs. Kerr, by Father Hutton at the altar, and by whoever else of the Catholic servants is free that morning. Sarah is usually free, the kitchen having been started. Margaret rarely, since she is at her cleaning. Thomas sometimes, Eliza often. There are perhaps 4 or 5 people kneeling on the low bench or on chairs at any given Mass. The Mass is the Latin Mass of the Roman Rite, said in the order that has been said for centuries in a hushed voice, with the responses given by the narrow congregation in Latin. There is no music, there is no incense, the household oratory not having the equipment for solemn Mass. There is, simply, the priest at the altar, the candles, the few people kneeling, the words in the old language that they have all known since childhood. The Mass takes about 30 minutes. It is over by 8:25. The household comes down to its morning duties. Maria stays in the chapel for a few minutes after the others have gone, kneels on the bench, says the simple set of prayers she has been saying since girlhood, and then comes downstairs to her own breakfast, which is taken in the morning room, alone, between 8 and 9:15. She has tea, toast, a boiled egg sometimes, fruit when there is fruit, the small milk roll that Mrs. Kerr makes once a week. She reads the morning paper, which has come down from London on the morning coach. She makes notes for the day in her household book. This morning's paper, on this Friday in late August of 1788, was the Morning Post. It carried the usual mixture of court news, theatrical news, parliamentary news in the recess, society notices, advertisements. There was a paragraph on the third page reporting that the Prince of Wales had been seen riding on the Stein the previous afternoon. There was a paragraph noting that the Duke of Cumberland was expected at Brighton next week. There was a substantial piece about the trial of Warren Hastings, which had been going on at Westminster Hall for months, and which Maria had been following with attention. There was a spare paragraph from Paris noting unrest in the markets, a restrained early notice of what would, in less than a year, become the great upheaval of Europe. Maria read the paper in the order she always read it. The foreign news first, then the parliamentary news, then the court and society pages, then the theatrical news, then the advertisements at the end. She finished her breakfast. She made her notes. Her morning, after breakfast, was given to the modest business of running her household. At 9:30, Mrs. Kerr came up from the kitchen with her account book and her menu suggestions for the week. They went over the household accounts at the table in the morning room. There was a plain dispute over the cost of beef, which had risen by a penny a pound since the previous month, and a question of whether they should be buying their fish directly from the boats on the beach, as they had been doing, or whether to use the fishmonger in the town, who was charging more but selling at a more convenient hour. Maria settled both questions in the gently practical manner she used for these things. The beef would be accepted at the new price. The fish would continue to be bought from the boats. She approved Mrs. Kerr's menus for the next 3 days, with a minor adjustment to Sunday's menu, to allow for the fact that her uncle would still be there. Mrs. Kerr left, and Maria spent half an hour writing letters at her desk. She wrote to her sister Frances about a little matter of family business. She wrote a brief reply to a letter from a Catholic widow in London who was applying for assistance from a charitable fund Maria contributed to. She wrote a short note to her cousin Mary Smythe at Brambridge. By 11:30, the morning's writing was done. She put on her bonnet and her cloak and went out for her morning walk. This was the part of her day that she liked the best. The Brighton seafront in late August, in the late morning, was at its most agreeable. The sea was calm, the air was warm, the bathing machines were drawn up on the beach with a steady stream of fashionable customers using them. The fishing boats were back from the morning's work and were laying out their catch on the shingle. The Stein was full of people walking, of fashionable people in carriages, of children playing, of dogs running. The town in late August was at its summer height. Maria walked with her uncle Henry Errington beside her, the two of them taking the long route along the cliff path to the east of the town, then turning back along the seafront, then up through the brief streets towards the pavilion, then across the open Stein, and so home. The walk took about an hour. They met perhaps a dozen people they knew, and stopped to speak with several of them. They met Lady Anne Lindsay, who would be coming to dinner that evening, and they confirmed the time. They met Mrs. Concannon, an Irish Catholic acquaintance who was at Brighton for the bathing. They met one of the Prince's equerries, who bowed to Maria with the particular slightly too deep bow that the Prince's people gave her, the bow that acknowledged her status without naming it. They met the rector of Brighton, an Anglican clergyman called Mr. Thomas Hudson, who was a friend of Maria's despite the difference in their churches, and whom Maria had helped quietly in the matter of a parish charity the previous year. They met the elderly Lady Clarges, who was a fixture of the Brighton summer set, who held Maria's hand for a moment and gave her a faint, fond look that meant nothing definite, but that Maria understood as a kind of older woman's recognition. The walk was, in this sense, a kind of narrow public reading of her social position. She met people. They greeted her. The greetings ranged from the formal bows of the prince's people to the warmer recognitions of the friends to the slightly cooler but still polite acknowledgments of the people who had decided that they did not approve of her position, but could not, in 1788, in Brighton, openly snub her. The whole walk was, in its simple, careful way, the daily business of being who she was in the place she was, of holding her ground in the social world without forcing the issue, of being recognised by enough of the right people that her position was understood without being declared. She came back to the house at 12:30, slightly tired, and went upstairs to take off her bonnet and her cloak, and to wash her hands and face and to compose herself for the rest of the day. Lunch was at 1:00. Lunch was a light meal, a cold soup made from vegetables of the kitchen garden. Since Mrs. Kerr had a walled garden plot at the back of the yard, a modest dish of cold lamb left over from the previous day's dinner, bread and butter, a slice of cherry tart, tea. Lunch was eaten in the dining room with her uncle and Father Hutton. The conversation at lunch was light, the gentle spare talk of three people who had been together for nearly a fortnight and who knew each other well. After lunch, she had an hour to herself. She went up to her bedroom. She lay on the bed. She read a little. She did not sleep. She sometimes slept after lunch in winter, but in summer, the late afternoon was too bright for sleeping. She read a few pages of a French novel that she had been working through, the latest by a writer she liked called Madame de Genlis, and she made a faint mark in her copy of the Missal next to the office she was meant to read for the next day. By 3 she was up and downstairs again. The afternoon she had given to a visit. There was a Catholic widow living in lodgings on the Marine Parade, the wife of a colonial official who had died at Madras some time earlier, and who was passing through Brighton on her way to a daughter in Hampshire who had written to Maria asking if she might call. Maria, who took these obligations seriously and who was always especially attentive to the restrained claims of Catholic women in difficult circumstances, had invited the widow for tea at 3. The widow, a Mrs. Caulfield, came at the hour appointed. She was perhaps 55, rather faded, still in mourning, in straitened circumstances. She had been recommended to Maria by a mutual Catholic acquaintance in London. Maria received her in the drawing-room, gave her tea, asked her about her late husband, listened to the long, somewhat rambling, tearful account of the difficulties of being a widow at 55 in lodgings, made several useful suggestions, and ended the visit by giving the widow a modest letter of introduction to a Catholic charitable society in London, which Maria considered well managed and which she thought might be of help. The widow was tearful again at the parting. Maria saw her to the door. She returned to the drawing-room tired and a little sad, with the particular fatigue that the charitable work of listening to other people's troubles leaves in the listener. It is the minor detail of an afternoon like this that historical biography rarely records. The hour with Mrs. Caulfield, the letter of introduction, the cup of the patient listening. Maria did this sort of thing constantly. She had, all her life, an unshowy attentiveness to the troubles of women in difficult circumstances, especially Catholic women, especially widows. She was herself a twice-widowed Catholic woman who had been left, after her first marriage, in a position not unlike the position Mrs. Caulfield was now in. She had not forgotten. She did not exhibit her concern. She did not write about her charity. She simply did the plain work, week after week, season after season, for 5 more decades to come, in whatever house she was living in. After the widow left, at about 4:15, Maria had her tea brought up to her in the drawing-room. She had it brought up alone. She wanted half an hour of her own company. She sat in her usual chair near the window, with the tea on a table beside her, and looked out at the street and let the afternoon settle. She was, by this point in the day, tired, but in no way unhappy. The day had been an ordinary day. The charity visit had been completed. The morning walk had been taken. The luncheon had been eaten. The widow had been received and helped. The afternoon was waning. The dinner was ahead. The evening was ahead. The regular rhythm of her Brighton summer was carrying her through the days as it had carried her through the summers before. At 5 o'clock, she went upstairs to dress. Mary Smith was waiting. The dressing took, as I described, about 40 minutes. By 6:20 she was downstairs again, dressed for dinner, ready to receive her uncle in the drawing-room when he came down from his own room, and her chaplain when he came in from the chapel, and her friend Lady Anne when she arrived from her lodging. This is the day that has ended. It has been, in its unhurried shape, the sort of day Maria Fitzherbert had, with brief variations, on perhaps 100 days annually for the next half-century. The morning mass, the breakfast alone, the household business, the morning walk, the lunch, the afternoon visit, the tea, the dressing, the evening. The pattern is so consistent through her life, so regular, so clearly the life she had chosen and built and held to, that even the drama of her marriage to the prince and the public crisis of 1787 and the future crises that are coming barely disturb it. She kept the pattern. She kept it through everything. The days of the great public storms were, when one looks closely at her letters, days that began with Mass and ended with prayers, and that carried whatever the storm was inside the steady frame of the plain Catholic widow's day. She is now in the drawing-room. Her Uncle Henry comes in from the library at 6:20, having finished his afternoon's work over a matter of family business that has needed attention. He greets her kindly and takes a seat near the fire. Father Hutton comes in from the chapel at 6:15, having said his evening office, and takes a seat opposite the uncle. Thomas Walsh, the footman, brings in a tray with 3 glasses of Madeira and a dish of olives. The 3 of them sit in the lamplight of the drawing-room, with the light still in the sky outside but beginning to fail, and they talk of ordinary things while they wait for the door to be answered for Lady Anne. Henry Errington is 55. He is the second son of the Errington Baronet of Catheaton in Northumberland, the brother of Maria's mother, the uncle who had walked her up the small drawing-room at Park Street on the night of her secret wedding. He has been, for Maria's whole adult life, the most reliable male figure in her family. Her father had died in 1788, earlier this year, in fact, after a long decline. Her Uncle Henry has, since that death, taken on for her the gentle role that her father had occupied, the older male relation who could be relied on for quiet, sound advice, who was always at the end of a letter, who came down to Brighton for fortnights when she asked, who managed small business affairs when she needed them managed. He is unmarried. He has his own small estate near Hexham. He is not a man of any public distinction. He is the kind of man very common in the small English Catholic gentry, who has lived a quiet, careful life within his community, has fulfilled his small obligations, has read his books, has hunted in season, has been a steady kind older relation to his sister's children, and has otherwise made no particular mark on the world. He is to Maria the closest thing she now has to a father. She loves him. He loves her. The relationship is utterly unspectacular and utterly important. Father Hutton, sitting opposite him, is a different kind of man. He is, as I mentioned, the product of a 12-year course at the English College at Douai, the great Catholic seminary in northern France that produced most of the English secular clergy of the 18th century. He went there at 16 in 1751. He was ordained in 1762. He spent 6 more years in continental clerical work after his ordination, then came back to England in 1768 to take up a position as chaplain to a Catholic family in Yorkshire. He moved through a succession of private chaplaincies until 1786, when he came to Maria on the recommendation of a mutual acquaintance, having heard that the prince's secret wife was looking for a discreet and well-educated chaplain. He has been here since then. He is, in the reserved way of an educated middle-aged celibate, contented in the position. He has a comfortable room. He has the chapel to look after. He has Maria's serious religious life to attend to. He has, in his own time, a long-running scholarly project on the early Christian fathers that he has been working on for a long while and expects, perhaps, to finish in his old age. He plays chess with Henry Errington in the evenings when there is no other company. He goes for long walks on the cliffs in the mornings before Mass. He is, in his contained and contented way, exactly where he wants to be. The 3 of them sip their Madeira. The conversation is desultory. Henry Errington has been reading a recent book of travels in Italy by a clergyman of his acquaintance and recommends it to Father Hutton. Father Hutton, who has himself never been to Italy and who would like to go before he is too old, asks questions about the book. Maria, who has read it and not been entirely persuaded, gives her own qualified opinion that the author is a better observer of buildings than of people. The conversation goes on in this vein for 10 minutes or so, unforced talk between 3 people who are comfortable with each other until the door knocker at the front sounds, and Thomas Walsh goes to answer it, and Lady Anne Lindsay is shown into the drawing-room. Lady Anne is 38. She is the eldest daughter of the 5th Earl of Balcarres, a Scottish peer of the older type. She is unmarried, intelligent, lively, unconventional in her habits and her conversation, a woman who in 1788 is genuinely difficult to place in the rigid social categories of the time. She is not a beauty. She is not rich. She is not, in any conventional sense, fashionable. She is, however, considerably more interesting than most of the conventionally fashionable women she moves among. 2 decades earlier, she had written a Scottish ballad called Old Robin Grey, a song about a young woman whose lover goes to sea and is reported lost, and who marries an older man for the sake of her family and then learns that her first lover is alive. The ballad had become widely popular under conditions of strict anonymity. Almost nobody knew that Lady Anne had written it. Lady Anne herself had never publicly acknowledged the authorship. The fact of the authorship was, however, known to a close inner circle of friends, of whom Maria was one. Maria had been told about it around 1785 and had been moved to read the song again, knowing that Lady Anne had written it, and had since regarded her friend with increased private respect. Lady Anne, for her part, knew that Maria knew, and knew that Maria had not told anyone, and the private knowledge had been one of the things that had cemented the friendship between them. Lady Anne is in Brighton for a fortnight. She is staying in lodgings in West Street with her own maid. She has come down because she likes Brighton, because the air agrees with her, because Maria is here, and because there is, this summer, a sufficient gathering of the people she likes to make the place agreeable. She is wearing a dark blue dress, less formal than Maria's grey-blue one, with a narrow lace collar and a single string of pearls. She is taller than Maria, thinner, with a long-nosed face that is not pretty, but is alive in a way that prettier faces sometimes are not. She greets the company with affection. She takes a glass of Madeira from Thomas Walsh. She sits on the sofa near Maria. The conversation with her arrival takes on a faster pace. The four of them talk for perhaps 10 minutes before dinner is announced. Lady Anne reports that she has had a letter from her sister in Edinburgh that morning containing pieces of family news that interest Maria. Henry Errington asks after one of Lady Anne's brothers, whom he had known a little in the army long before. Father Hutton, who knows Lady Anne less well than Maria's uncle does, but who likes her, asks her whether she has been to the small Catholic chapel in West Street that the foreign Catholic visitors sometimes used, the chapel that was attached to the lodgings of the Spanish ambassador's chaplain, who came down to Brighton each summer with his master. Lady Anne says she had not, but had been thinking about it. The conversation moves to a discussion of a piece of music that Maria has been learning on the pianoforte. Lady Anne, who has a good musical ear, asks her to play it after dinner. Maria says she will if she does not embarrass herself. Dinner is announced at 6:20. The four of them go through to the dining room. Maria takes the head of the table. Her uncle takes the foot. Father Hutton sits to Maria's right. Lady Anne sits to her left. The table is set, with the household's best silver, although not its very best, since this is not a formal occasion. The candles are lit. The room is small enough that the candles, with the late August evening light still coming in through the windows, are sufficient. Thomas Walsh is at the sideboard. Mrs. Kerr is in the kitchen. The dinner that Mrs. Kerr has prepared is a perfectly executed example of what an Irish Catholic cook in the service of an English Catholic gentry household in 1788 produced for an unobtrusive but careful family dinner. The first course consists of a clear soup made from a beef stock, served with a small dish of bread fingers. There is a roast chicken with a bread sauce. There is a piece of cold lamb left from the earlier meal, dressed with a green sauce of herbs from the kitchen garden. There is a dish of small new potatoes. There is a dish of green beans picked that morning. There are two small side dishes, one of pickled cucumbers and one of mushrooms in cream. The food is brought to the table by Thomas Walsh and is served from the dishes onto the plates by the diners themselves, in the older fashion that was still general in households of this size in 1788. The newer service à la Russe, where the food was carved at the sideboard and served onto plates by the footman, was beginning to come in among the more fashionable London households, but was not yet usual in a household of this kind. The wine is a single hock for the first course, a Mosel, light and pale, that Maria's wine merchant in London has been sending her in small quantities for the past year and that she is fond of. There is a claret for the chicken, a Bordeaux of moderate vintage, perfectly drinkable but not remarkable. There will be a sweet wine with the dessert. The conversation at dinner ranges over the small subjects of friends and family that occupy the conversation of any small dinner of intimates. Lady Anne tells a long and characteristically observant story about a London hostess of their acquaintance who has just married off her last unmarriageable daughter to a baronet in Yorkshire by the simple expedient of making the daughter sufficiently terrified of remaining unmarried that the daughter accepted the first proposal she received. Lady Anne tells the story with a small dry edge that is her particular conversational style, and Maria, who knows the people involved, laughs in the secluded way that Lady Anne's stories produced in her. Henry Errington, who had not heard the story, asks several questions to clarify the cast of characters. Father Hutton, who knew none of the people involved, but who had a quiet appreciation of well-told gossip, listens with the particular grave attention that he gave to all conversation, religious or worldly. Maria asks Lady Anne about a poet they have both been reading, the Scottish writer Robert Burns, whose first volume of poems had been published in 1786, and whose work was being passed around the more literary parts of London society with considerable interest. Lady Anne, who had read Burns with attention, and who, as a Scotswoman with her own private literary life, had a personal interest in him, gives a reasonably long account of the poems, of the controversy about his peasant background and his irregular morals, of the way his poetry had been received in the Edinburgh literary circles. Maria, who is herself a more restrained reader, and finds some of Burns's poems too rough for her taste, says she has been more taken with the shorter pieces, the songs and the religious lyrics, than with the longer narrative pieces. Lady Anne agrees that the songs are perhaps the heart of him. Henry Errington, who has not read Burns, says he should perhaps make the effort. Father Hutton, who has read Burns and has private reservations about the poet's relationship with the Scottish Calvinist establishment, makes a few mild remarks on the difficulty of being a serious religious poet from a religious tradition that does not value beauty in worship. The conversation moves through the courses. There is no main subject. There are simply the minor subjects of a modest conducted in the unforced way of people who like each other. The chicken is excellent, the lamb is good, the wine is taken in moderation. The dessert, when it arrives, is a fruit tart with cream made by Mrs. Kerr from the late raspberries of the kitchen garden. The sweet wine is a Sauternes that her uncle has brought down with him as a contribution to the table. After the dessert, in the older fashion that the Fitzherbert household maintained, the cloth is removed from the table by Thomas Walsh, leaving the polished surface bare, and a dish of fruit and a dish of nuts are placed on the table, with the decanters of port and Madeira and the little wine glasses. The custom of the ladies leaving the gentlemen at this point was, in 1788, still general in larger and more formal dinners, but was often dispensed with at intimate family dinners like this, especially when the gentlemen present were a clergyman and an elderly relative who could be expected to behave themselves in mixed company. Maria, who in any case prefers to keep her dinners conversational rather than formal, decides to keep the company together. The four of them remain at the table for another half hour, drinking narrow glasses of port and Madeira, eating the fruit and nuts, talking. The conversation by this point has moved into the slower and more reflective register that comes with the end of a meal. Henry Errington tells a story from his youth about a hunting accident in Northumberland 4 decades earlier that Maria has heard before, but that the others have not. Father Hutton talks briefly about a Latin commentary on the Psalms that he has been reading. Lady Anne tells another brief story about her sister. By 8 o'clock, the four of them are getting up from the table. They go through, all four together, to the drawing room. Thomas Walsh has in the meantime brought up the coffee on a silver tray and set it on the round table near the fireplace. Maria pours. They settle into their chairs and sofas. The evening, which has now been going on for 2 hours, has reached the slower and more reflective phase that follows a good dinner with friends. Music, in a household like Maria's in 1788, occupied a place in the evening that it does not quite occupy in any modern household, and it is worth understanding what music meant in this room on this evening before the actual playing of it begins. The Broadwood pianoforte against the far wall, 6-year-old, was one of the early generation of the new English square pianofortes that had been displacing the harpsichord during the previous decade. It had a delicate, sweet, wooden tone considerably softer than a modern instrument, with a range of about 5 octaves. It had been bought for Maria in 1782 by her second husband Thomas in the final stretch before his death, and it had travelled with her between her London house and her country lodgings ever since. It was, after the cross around her neck and the painting of the Virgin in the chapel, perhaps the object in her possession that meant the most to her personally. She played it most days, for at least an hour, sometimes alone, sometimes for whoever was in the house with her. Music, in the educated households of 1788, was not chiefly a thing one listened to. It was a thing one made. A young woman of Maria's class would have been taught to play from childhood, would have practiced regularly through her adolescence, would have continued to play, with whatever degree of skill she had developed throughout her adult life. The repertoire of the educated woman pianist in 1788 was a defined one. There were the Italian masters Corelli and Geminiani at the older end, and the new music of Italian-trained composers like Clementi and Dussek, who were active in London. There were the German masters, Handel above all, who had died nearly 3 decades earlier, but whose oratorios and instrumental music remained the central repertoire of educated English musical taste. There was the rising star of the European musical world, Mozart, whose pieces were beginning to circulate in London, but were still regarded by older listeners as somewhat advanced and difficult. There was Haydn, whose symphonies were popular at the public concerts, but whose keyboard works were less often heard. There were the Scottish and English songs that everyone in the period sang, the airs from the Beggar's Opera, the Scotch songs that Burns and others were collecting and reworking, the sacred songs from the Anglican and Methodist traditions that crossed over into domestic music-making. Maria's repertoire was, by the standards of her class, unusually serious. She played the Italian masters, particularly the slower movements of Corelli that she had been taught as a girl. She played a great deal of Handel, particularly the keyboard arrangements of arias from the oratorios. She played Mozart, 2 of the smaller keyboard sonatas in particular that she had been working at recently. She sang. Her voice was a soft mezzo-soprano of moderate range, well trained from her Paris convent days, used with the small, careful musical intelligence that distinguished a serious amateur singer from a self-conscious one. She sang in French, Italian, and English. She sang sacred music more than secular, partly from religious habit, and partly because the sacred repertoire of the period was in fact the finest part of the available music for her voice. After coffee, Lady Anne, who has been waiting, asks Maria again to play the piece they discussed before dinner. Maria says she will. She goes over to the pianoforte, sits down on the small embroidered stool, opens the music she has set out, and looks at it for a moment. It is a slow movement of a Mozart sonata that she has been working at for some weeks. She begins to play. The room becomes still. The other 3 settle into their chairs to listen. Henry Errington, who is moderately fond of music but not particularly knowledgeable, listens with his eyes closed. Father Hutton, who has a serious interest in music and considerable knowledge of the older religious repertoire, listens with the alert attention of a man who knows what he is hearing. Lady Anne, who is Maria's most musically intelligent listener and who has played all the same pieces herself, listens with the particular sympathy of a fellow practitioner. Maria plays. The music is of the kind that the late 18th century did better than perhaps any other moment in European history. The slow movement of an instrumental piece that moves with absolute clarity through a small set of harmonic and melodic patterns that has no display, no excess, only the steady, unhurried unfolding of a musical idea over 5 or 6 minutes of careful playing. She plays the movement through. There are perhaps 2 or 3 small fumbles in the more difficult passages, which she covers smoothly enough that only Lady Anne notices, and Lady Anne does not remark on them. The piece ends. The room is quiet for a moment. Lady Anne says quietly that the playing was very fine. Father Hutton agrees. Maria, who is not a vain woman about her playing, says that she had been working at it for some weeks, and that it still required more practice. She closes the music. She does not get up from the pianoforte yet. She plays one more piece, a small song by Henry Purcell, the 17th century English composer, whose work Maria particularly loved, and which she sang with more confidence than she sang anything else. She sings the song through, accompanying herself, in her soft, careful voice. The song is one of Purcell's slower devotional pieces, a setting of a religious text from the Anglican repertoire, the kind of piece that crossed easily across the religious divide, because the theology of the words was general enough, and the music was beautiful enough, that no Catholic listener could have objected to it. She sings it through. The room listens. The song ends. There is the small silence of music recently finished. Lady Anne, who has a clear soprano voice of moderate range, and who has sung with Maria many times before, asks if she might sing something with her, if Maria would play. Maria turns the music. There is a small 2-voice setting of another Purcell piece, an anthem with 2 solo lines that fit together in the close harmony of the late 17th century English style, that the 2 of them have sung together before, and that they both know well enough to do without much rehearsal. Lady Anne comes over and stands beside the pianoforte. Maria plays the introduction. The 2 voices come in. Lady Anne's soprano is brighter than Maria's mezzo, slightly thinner in the lower register but clear and true in the higher. The 2 voices fit each other, as voices that have sung together for a long time come to fit, with the adjustments of intonation and timing that only practice produces. They sing the piece through. The harmonies in the drawing room with its low fire and its candles have the quiet beauty of music made for this sort of room and this sort of evening, the domestic music of the late 17th century that was now, a century later, being kept alive in the drawing rooms of women who valued it. The piece ends. The 2 of them stand for a moment near the pianoforte, smiling at each other with the private recognition of singers who have done well together. Lady Anne returns to her sofa. Maria stays at the pianoforte for a minute longer, putting the music away, ordering the pages on the stand. She thinks briefly, as one does after a piece of music well sung, that singing with a friend in one's own drawing room on a late summer evening is one of the intimate pleasures of the life she has built, and that there have been many such evenings, and that there will, she hopes, be many more. This was, in fact, one of the things her music meant to her before the evening moves on. The music in Maria's drawing room was not, as it would later become in 19th century domestic life, an evening's entertainment performed for a passive audience. It was a shared activity, conducted between people who could mostly read music and many of whom played or sang, in which the participation was the point. Lady Anne sang because Lady Anne could sing. Maria played because Maria could play. Father Hutton, when there was sacred music, sang the bass line in his worn priestly voice. Henry Errington occasionally took up his violin, which he kept at Catheaton and brought down only rarely for a duet on the rare evenings when one of the proper duet pieces was at hand. The music was, in this sense, one of the activities that constituted the social life of the room. It was something one did with one's friends, like conversation, like cards, like the chess game in the corner. The performance and the appreciation were the same act. When Maria played the slow movement of the Mozart sonata, Lady Anne was not an audience. She was a fellow musician listening with the attention of someone who had played the same piece. The shared knowledge was the meaning of the listening. This way of having music in a private house was, in 1788, on the verge of changing. The new generation of public concerts was beginning, in London especially, to shift the balance away from amateur domestic music making toward professional performance for paying audiences. Within 4 decades, the Victorian drawing room would have, in many cases, the different texture of a single performer at the piano, with a passive family ranged round listening politely. But in 1788, in this house, the older 18th century pattern still holds. Maria plays, Lady Anne sings, Father Hutton sometimes takes the bass, the room makes the music together, and the music belongs to all of them as a kind of shared possession. She returns to her chair near the fire. It is now about 8:15. The light has gone from outside. The candles in the drawing room are burning steadily. The conversation resumes in its slower evening register. Lady Anne tells Maria about a little piece of theatrical news from London that has reached her via her sister. Henry Errington reads briefly from a small volume of his own poetry that he has been carrying around in his pocket and that he occasionally inflicts on people, the inflictions being received by his niece and her friends with the tolerant amusement of people who like him too much to mind. Father Hutton, who has been listening to all of this with the genial, unobtrusive attention of a clergyman on a social evening, takes down a small chess set from a shelf and asks Henry Errington whether they might play a game while the ladies talk. The 2 men move the chess set to a plain table in the corner, set up the pieces, and begin a slow, careful game that will last most of the rest of the evening. This is the texture of the drawing room that I want you to be inside. 2 old men playing chess in the corner, 2 women on the sofa near the fire, talking, the candles burning, the fire in the grate, low and steady, the sea half a mile away, audible just barely through the stillness of the late August night, the pianoforte silent now, the music closed on its stand, the room warm, settled, comfortable, the small central place of an ordinary evening in the life of a woman who is, on the surface, the secret wife of the heir to the throne, and who is, in the substance of her actual existence, a quietly observant Catholic gentlewoman, entertaining her uncle and her friend and her chaplain in the drawing-room of her own house in a fashionable seaside town. It is at this point in the evening, on this particular Friday in late August of 1788, that the small interruption comes that I have been mentioning at the edges of the description. The Prince of Wales, from the pavilion across the Stein, has decided to walk over and look in for half an hour. He does this perhaps 3 or 4 times a week when they are both in Brighton. There is no particular ceremony about it. He sends a small note round in the late afternoon if he intends to come. The note tonight came at 5. It said simply that he would walk over after his own dinner at the pavilion and would look in. Maria, who had received the note while she was dressing, had told Mary Smith, who had told Thomas Walsh, who had told Mrs. Kerr, who had set aside a modest portion of the dessert in case the prince stayed for a slice of it. The household had absorbed the note into the evening's planning without any disturbance. The prince's evening visits had become, by this point in the marriage, simply one of the small predictable elements of life in Brighton. He arrives at 8:30. Thomas Walsh answers the door. The prince is shown into the drawing room. He is not formally announced. He is just there, suddenly, in the doorway, glancing slightly at his wife, who rises from her chair to greet him. "I am going to handle the next half hour with restraint, because the Prince of Wales, even in 1788, when he was 26 and not yet quite the bloated figure of the Regency caricatures, had a way of dominating a room that cuts entirely against the grain of what tonight's story is about. So I will simply tell you what happened, briefly, and then I will move on." He came in. He greeted his wife with a quiet kiss on the cheek and the small inquiring look that he gave her when he wanted to know how the evening had been so far. He greeted Henry Errington and Father Hutton, who had risen from their chess game, and bowed to Lady Anne, who curtsied to him. He sat in the chair that Lady Anne had been sitting in, Lady Anne having moved to a smaller chair near the writing table to give him the more comfortable seat. He took a glass of Madeira. He told Maria a modest piece of news from a letter he had received that afternoon. He asked Lady Anne about her family. He listened to a brief account from Henry Errington of the chess game that had been suspended by his arrival. He laughed at one of Lady Anne's small, dry observations. He drank his Madeira. He asked Maria, in a slightly lower voice, about the small headache she had mentioned to him the day before, which he had remembered. She said it was much better. He nodded. He drank some more Madeira. He stayed for 35 minutes. He was, throughout, the calm and decent version of himself that he was when he was with Maria and her circle, the version of himself that had drawn her to him in the first place and that she had been hoping, across the marriage, to see more of, and the other versions of him less of. He was not the public prince. He was not the Whig prince of Devonshire House. He was not the angry son of his father. He was a young man visiting his wife and her friends in her drawing room on a summer evening. He was, for the half hour he was there, almost ordinary. He left at 9:05, having said that he must get back to the pavilion to attend to a matter of correspondence, which was true. He kissed his wife briefly. He bowed to the company. He walked out. When the front door closed behind him, the 4 people who had been in the room before he came in remained. They settled back into their chairs. Thomas Walsh removed the empty glass. The chess game was resumed. Lady Anne took her position back on the sofa. The conversation moved on. Maria, who had been quiet throughout the visit, and whose face had borne the small, careful expression that she always wore when the prince was in the room with other people, returned slowly to her own ordinary expression. She did not, in the way of people who have just had an important visitor, talk about the visit. She simply resumed where she had been before. So did the others. The visit closed itself behind the closing door. The evening continued. This was, in its way, one of the things that Lady Anne admired most about her friend, and that she would later, in the small private memoir she wrote, and that survives in fragments, identify as the heart of Maria's character. Maria had absorbed, since the marriage in 1785, the visits of the prince into the texture of her ordinary life so completely that they no longer disturbed it. She had not allowed her life to become organized around his appearances. She had not become a woman waiting for him to come. She had her household, her friends, her reading, her music, her devotions, her uncle, her chaplain, her servants, her own days and her own evenings, and the prince was a visitor to those days and evenings, an important visitor, a beloved visitor, but a visitor. He came and went. The life continued in its own rhythm whether he came or did not. This was, Lady Anne thought, the secret of how Maria had managed the strange position she had been placed in. She had refused to let the position become her life. She had kept her life, and the position was something that intersected with it from the side, like the weather. The chess game continued. Henry Errington took a bishop. Father Hutton, who had been losing gradually through the evening, considered his position with the concentrated frown that meant he was working out whether to resign or to play on. He decided to play on. He moved a knight. Henry Errington, who had been planning the exchange that Father Hutton had not seen, took the knight. Father Hutton made a murmured sound of self-reproach. The game continued. Lady Anne and Maria talked of less and less consequential things as the evening got later. Lady Anne's lodgings on West Street. The lodgings landlady, who was a great character. The plans for the next day. Lady Anne would come over again in the morning, after Mass, to walk on the Marine Parade if the weather held. Maria thought it would. Their conversation eased, as people's conversations do when an evening is drawing to a close, until they were sitting in companionable silence more than they were talking. It was now approaching 10 o'clock. Lady Anne, who was a considerate guest, and who did not like to outstay an evening, rose at 10:05 and said she ought to go home. Henry Errington, with practised politeness, said he would walk her to her lodgings. Lady Anne said it was hardly necessary. Henry insisted mildly. Lady Anne, who liked being walked home by the older men of her acquaintance, allowed herself to be persuaded. The two of them prepared to leave. Maria embraced Lady Anne at the door. They confirmed the morning walk. Henry kissed his niece on the forehead. The two of them went out into the late summer night. The front door closed. Maria turned back into the drawing-room. Father Hutton, who had been staring at the chessboard since Henry's last move, looked up at her. The chess game was effectively over, his position being beyond rescue. He swept the pieces back into their box with a smile. He stood. He said he would say his evening office in the chapel before retiring. He bowed to her in the old manner and left the room. Maria was alone in the drawing-room. She stood for a moment in the middle of the room. The candles were burning down. The fire was low. The clock on the mantel was ticking. From outside came, very faintly, the sound of the sea, far down beyond the houses on the south side of the street. She walked over to the pianoforte. She put her hand on the keys lightly, without playing. She closed the music she had been playing earlier. She walked over to the fire. She watched the low flames for a moment. She thought, as one thinks at the end of an evening, about nothing definite. She had perhaps another half hour before she would go up. She was not ready for bed yet. She sat down in her usual chair near the fire, picked up the book she had been reading earlier in the day, the slender French novel by Madame de Genlis, and read for a quarter of an hour by the light of the candles. The book was a moderately good novel of its kind, less serious than what she usually preferred, but agreeable for a settled hour at the end of an evening. Madame de Genlis was, in 1788, one of the more popular French women writers being read in England. She wrote moralizing fiction designed for the education of young women, and she was the governess of the children of the Duke of Orleans, the Bourbon prince who would soon become the central figure of the early French Revolution as Philippe Eagerlight before being guillotined himself in 1793. The novel Maria was reading was a recent one, a short pious narrative about a young woman who navigates several moral difficulties with the help of her religion and her common sense, and who is rewarded with a settled and contented marriage at the end. It was not great literature. It was decent reading. It belonged to the very large category of late 18th century improving novels written for women that the period produced in great quantity, and that have since mostly been forgotten. Maria's reading life in 1788 and through her whole adulthood had a shape that is worth a moment's attention. She read, mostly, in three categories. She read religious works, including the Latin of her Missal and the Breviary, the French and English devotional writers her chaplain recommended, the lives of the saints, occasional theological works of moderate weight that came to her through Father Hutton or through her uncle. She read fiction, both English and French, of the sort currently being produced for women readers, the moralizing novels of de Genlis and Burney, and the older epistolary novels of Richardson and the French sentimental tradition. She read a steady amount of history, mostly in the form of the lives of great women, the queens and the religious figures and the occasional female intellectual, that the 18th century considered the appropriate historical reading for an educated woman. She did not read much. The great male intellectual works of the period, the philosophical writers and the political economists, and the heavier sort of historical writing that her brothers and her uncle and her chaplain would have read. The division was not because she could not have followed those books. She was perfectly capable of following them. The division was simply the conventional one of her time and class. She read what educated women of her position read, in the proportions in which they read it. The reading mattered to her. It was one of the things that filled the unstructured hours of her widowhood, and one of the things she had increasingly come to depend on as time passed, the morning hours after breakfast, when the household business was done, the hour after lunch, when the rest of the household was about its own affairs, the half hour before bed, when the rest of the day had been done. These were the times she read. The reading was, in some sense, the inner life of her days, the private conversation she had with herself and with the books she chose, that ran underneath the more visible social texture of the visiting and the household running and the entertaining. Lady Anne knew about her reading because they discussed it. Father Hutton knew about her reading because he supplied some of it. Mary Smith knew about it because she dusted the books. Almost no one else in Maria's life had any access to this layer of her existence. She read until the candles began to smoke slightly. She put the book down. She thought again about her sister's letter and about her mother's health, which had been the small worry running underneath the day. She made a small mental note to write a longer letter to her sister tomorrow, and to ask her uncle, before he left next week, to call on her mother on his way north. Henry Errington came back from walking Lady Anne home at 20 to 11. He came into the drawing-room briefly, said the night had turned a little cooler, but was clear and beautiful, asked her if she was going up, said he was going up himself. The two of them stood for a moment together by the fire. He kissed her again on the forehead in the small, steady, fond way that was part of his character, and went up. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, heard him on the landing, heard the door of his room close. She was now alone on the ground floor of the house. She walked slowly through the rooms, doing the small final tasks of the evening that she always did before going up. She straightened the cushions on the sofa. She closed the lid of the pianoforte. She put the chess set away on its shelf. She blew out the candles in the big drawing room one by one, leaving only a single one alight in a small holder she would carry up. She walked through to the dining room, where Thomas Walsh had already cleared the table, but she checked anyway, the way she always did, that the room was as it should be. She walked through to the library, where she straightened a cushion that had been displaced and replaced a book on a shelf where it belonged. She returned to the hall. She checked that the front door was bolted, the chains on. The whole circuit took perhaps 10 minutes. It was the small, private, compulsive right of a woman who took the running of her household seriously, and who liked to know, at the end of each evening, that the house was set right for the night. She went up the stairs with her single candle. The candle threw its small moving light along the wall as she went. The house was almost entirely quiet. From below, from the kitchen wing, she could hear the faint sounds of Mrs. Kerr and the maids finishing the last of the washing up, but the sounds were distant. From the floor above, where her uncle's room was, there was no sound. Father Hutton, presumably, was still in the chapel saying his evening office. She paused on the first floor landing outside the door of the chapel. She could hear faintly the murmur of Father Hutton's voice through the door. He was saying the office aloud, as priests in private did, the slow Latin of the divine office that the Roman clergy said every day in 7 canonical hours, the office that was the central daily prayer of the priestly life. She stood for a moment, listening. The Latin was not entirely audible through the door, but the rhythm of it was, the measured rising and falling cadence of the psalms, the pauses between the verses, the settled pace of a man who had been saying these prayers in this form for more than a quarter century. She stood for the length of perhaps 3 or 4 verses, listening, before she went on to her bedroom. Mary Smith was waiting in the bedroom. She had been waiting for half an hour, having brought up the washing water from the kitchen at 10:30 in anticipation of her mistress coming up. She rose from the low chair near the fireplace as Maria came in, took the candle, set it on the dressing table, and began the long unhurried process of undressing. The undressing took, as the dressing had taken, about 40 minutes. The hair was taken down. The pearl earrings were removed, replaced in their velvet box, and the box returned to the cabinet. The pearls at the throat were taken off and put away. The dress was unhooked at the back and lifted over the head, then hung on the dressing form to be brushed by Mary in the morning before being put away. The petticoats were removed. The corset was unlaced. The underlinen was changed for a fresh nightdress of fine white cotton, with a narrow blue ribbon at the throat. Mary brushed Maria's hair, with patient attention, for 100 strokes, and rebraided it in a single thick plait for the night. The whole process was conducted in near silence. The 2 women had done it together since the mid-1770s. There was nothing to say. When Maria was in her nightdress and her hair was braided, she sat for a moment at the dressing table while Mary went around the room arranging things for the night. The glass carafe of water on the night table, the chamber pot ready in its closet, the fire in the grate, which Mary banked down, the candles around the room, all but one extinguished, the bed, which Mary had turned down, the clothes for the morning, which Mary laid out on the chair. Maria watched her in the glass without seeing her, as one watches the familiar movements of a person who has been part of one's domestic landscape for a very long time. Before Mary left the room, Maria said good night to her quietly. Mary returned the good night and left, taking with her the discarded dress and the petticoats. The door closed behind her. Maria was alone in the room. She did one more thing before she got into bed. She took the candle from the dressing table, walked through the small connecting room, and went into the chapel, Father Hutton had finished his office some minutes earlier and had gone to his own room. The chapel was empty. The candles on the altar were not lit. The small painting of the Virgin and Child was barely visible in the light of the single candle Maria had brought with her. She knelt at the kneeling bench. She set the candle on the modest table next to the bench. She said her evening prayers. The evening prayers of an educated Catholic woman in 1788 were a more substantial set of prayers than the modern equivalent. They consisted of a small set of standard prayers, the Pater Noster and the Ave Maria and the Credo, said in Latin, followed by a short examination of conscience, in which the day was reviewed quietly, and any small failings were noted, and a brief act of contrition was made. They concluded with a longer prayer of recommendation to God for the night, asking for protection for the household and the dear ones absent, and for the souls of the dead. The whole set of prayers took, when said carefully, about 20 minutes. Maria said them carefully. She prayed for her mother. She prayed for her father, who had died earlier in the year, that his soul might have rest. She prayed for her 2 husbands, both of them long dead. Both of them remembered in the same set of prayers each night. She prayed for her Uncle Henry, asleep in the room next door. She prayed for her sister Frances and her brothers John and Walter. She prayed for her chaplain. She prayed for her servants. She prayed, last, for the Prince of Wales, that he might be guided in the difficulties of his life. She did not pray, specifically, for herself. The Catholic tradition did not particularly encourage praying for oneself, except in the general acts of contrition and recommendation. She made the general acts. She rose from the kneeling bench. She crossed herself. She blew out the candle on the altar that she had lit when she came in. She took her own candle, went back into her bedroom. She got into bed. She blew out the candle. The room was dark, with only the small red glow of the banked fire in the grate giving any light at all. The bed was warm under the blankets. The night air through the slightly opened window was cool. She lay for a few minutes on her back, with her eyes open, looking at the dim shape of the canopy above her. She thought about the day, the morning mass, the breakfast, the morning walk with her uncle, the visit from Mrs. Caulfield, the dressing, the dinner, the music, the prince, the chess game, Lady Anne, the evening, the day, in its small, unremarkable shape, settled into her as she lay there. She turned on her side. She closed her eyes. She slept. The house settled around her. Henry Errington, in the room next door, was already asleep, a quiet sleeper of long habit. Father Hutton, on the floor above, was reading for a few more minutes by his candle. Mary Smith, in her plain room on the second floor, was undressing for bed, the last act of her own day. Mrs. Kerr, in the basement, was finishing in the kitchen. Thomas Walsh was on his final round of the house, checking that all the doors were locked. By 11:30, the house was entirely quiet. By midnight, everyone in it was asleep. Outside, the late summer night was clear. The stars were bright over the small, fashionable town, over the modest classical pavilion across the Stein, where the prince was at this moment hosting a card party that would go on until 2 a.m, over the rows of new stuccoed houses going up along the seafront, over the medieval lanes of the old fishing village, over the long pebble beach where the bathing machines were drawn up for the night, and where the fishing boats were resting, hauled up on the shingle, ready for the morning's tide. The sea, beyond the beach, was at its low, slow, late summer rhythm, the small waves breaking lightly on the shingle. In the upstairs back room of the modest house on North Row, Maria Ann Fitzherbert, formerly Maria Ann Smythe of Brambridge, formerly Maria Ann Weld of Lulworth, twice widowed before the age of 25, secretly married to the Prince of Wales since December 1785, aged 32, devout Catholic, careful householder, kind employer, faithful friend, beloved niece, slept her ordinary night's sleep. She would wake at her usual hour for the morning mass. The day after this would be like the day before this. The pattern would hold. The last part of this listening belongs to what came after, not to the prince, whose life is amply described elsewhere, but to her, because the woman who slept on this Friday night in August of 1788 had nearly half a century of life ahead of her, and what she did with that long remainder is what tonight's evening was setting up, and it is worth knowing. The marriage to the prince held in this form until 1794. They lived between London and Brighton in the familiar pattern. He came over to her house each evening when they were in the same town. They were treated by the people who chose to recognise the marriage as if they were married. The Whig set, especially the Devonshires, took her as one of theirs. The Tories ignored her. The court did not receive her. The general public considered her, with some accuracy, the prince's wife under whatever ambiguous legal status. The newspapers wrote of her with discretion. The cartoonists were less discreet, and Gilray's satirical prints regularly included her, usually with more sympathy than was given to the prince. She was, during those seasons, generally well regarded. Then came 1794. The prince was, by this point, in financial difficulties so severe that his father refused to relieve them unless he agreed to make a legitimate marriage. The political pressure on him was immense. He had run through every form of credit available to him. His debts ran to over £600,000, an unimaginable sum. The only way out, the only way to settle the debts and obtain the income increase he needed from Parliament, was a legitimate marriage to a Protestant princess. In the summer of 1794, he wrote to Maria, ending their relationship. He wrote without warning. The letter arrived at her London house. She read it. She refused to believe it at first. She wrote back asking him to come and see her. He did not come. She wrote again. He did not respond. She understood, gradually, that the letter had been final, that he was, in fact, abandoning her. She made one decision in the following weeks that deserves a moment of stillness. She did not, in any public way, contest the abandonment. She did not appeal to the press. She did not write to her Whig friends asking them to take up her cause. She did not appeal to the King or the Queen. She simply withdrew. She left London. She went to a modest house in Margate, on the Kent coast, where she had taken refuge before, and she stayed there with her servants and her chaplain in seclusion for months. She wrote almost no letters during this interval. She received very few visitors. She mourned privately in the way she had been raised to mourn, with her Catholic devotions and her quiet daily routine and the sea and her household around her. The prince married Caroline of Brunswick on the 8th of April 1795. The marriage was, by every contemporary account, a disaster from the wedding day. The bride was not, by his standards, attractive. The bride was widely described as ill-mannered, unclean, and politically unintelligent. The groom was drunk through the ceremony and was sick in the fireplace in the hours afterward. They produced a single child, Princess Charlotte, in January 1796, and then they ceased to live together, and they spent the next quarter century in increasingly public mutual hostility, Caroline going eventually to live abroad and the prince agitating, eventually unsuccessfully, for a divorce. The marriage was the central catastrophe of the prince's adult life. Maria, watching it from a distance, understood within 12 months that the abandonment had been not so much a personal rejection as a political act, that the prince had been forced into a marriage he did not want and had needed to dispose of her in order to take it on, and that he was, even within months of the new marriage, miserable. He came back to her, gradually. The first letters arrived in late 1795. He wrote of his unhappiness. He wrote of his regret. He wrote, eventually, of his wish to resume the relationship. She did not answer the early letters. She answered the later ones, but with caution. She made one condition, in 1799, that she would not return to him until and unless the Pope ruled that her marriage to him in 1785 was, in the eyes of the Catholic Church, valid, and that his subsequent civil marriage to Caroline was, therefore, invalid in canon law. She wrote to Rome through a Catholic intermediary. The case was considered. The ruling came back in late 1799 that her marriage was indeed valid, that it had been a true sacramental marriage in the eyes of the Church, that the civil marriage to Caroline was not, in canon law, a true marriage, and that she was free, in conscience, to resume relations with the prince as her husband. She returned to him in the summer of 1800. They lived together again, on much the same pattern as before, until 1811. She was happier in this second phase than she had been in the first. The prince, having lost her once and won her back, treated her with steadier consideration than he had during the first marriage. The household was, again, two households, hers and his, with him visiting her each evening. They were in Brighton together every summer. They were in London together every winter. She was, again, generally accepted in the society that was willing to accept her. The relationship, in this second phase, was the most settled and contented of her life. It ended in 1811, when the prince became regent on his father's permanent descent into madness. The new political position made the relationship politically untenable in a way it had not been before. He had to consider a new marriage if Caroline could be put aside. He had to maintain the appearance of a regular royal life. He could not, enter as regent, continue the open quasi-marriage with Maria that he had been carrying on as Prince of Wales. The pressures were institutional rather than personal. The end was therefore not a personal abandonment in the way the 1794 break had been, but a slow institutional drifting apart. He stopped coming to her in the evenings. He stopped writing the daily notes. He took up gradually with Lady Hertford, who became his next attachment. Maria, in 1811, was 55. She was no longer the woman he had married at 23. She had, in any case, grown tired. She withdrew again, this time permanently. She did not return to him. She moved permanently to Brighton in 1812. She had, by this point, the house she would die in, which was the larger Stein house that the architect William Porden had built for her in 1804, replacing the smaller establishment that I have placed her in tonight. She had her two adopted daughters, Mary Seymour and Marianne Smith, who had come into her care at different points in the 1790s and 1800s and whom she raised as her own. Mary Seymour, in particular, was the great love of her later life, a child she had taken in as an infant after the death of the child's mother, Lady Horatia Seymour, and whom she had fought a long legal battle to be allowed to keep, a battle she eventually won with the prince's active help. Mary grew up, married, and remained close to Maria throughout her life. From 1812 to 1830, Maria's life settled into a calmer shape. She lived at Stein House. She entertained friends. She practiced her devotions. She took her morning walk on the seafront. She visited the poor. She corresponded with her old circle. She had the modest, orderly late life of a woman who had been through a great deal and had come out of it with her dignity, her household, her faith, and her 2 adopted daughters intact. This stretch deserves a moment before the prince's death and her own, because the late life of Maria Fitzherbert is the part of her story that is least often told, and that, in some ways, contains her most fully. By 1815, she was 60. The great public storms of her life were over. The prince had moved on. Her position was what it was, and she had accepted it. She lived from 1812 onward in the larger Stein house that the architect William Porden had built for her in 1804, a comfortable Regency villa on the eastern side of the Stein, with a modest garden, with a view toward the now much transformed pavilion, with its rooms decorated in the quieter Regency taste that suited her by this point in her life better than the heavier Georgian style of her youth. The household in this period had largely stayed with her. Mary Smith, her lady's maid, was now in her late 60s and was still attending her, although Mary's duties had been gradually adjusted to suit her age, with a younger woman taken on under her to do the heavier work. Mrs. Kerr had died in 1809 after 27 years' service to Maria, and her place had been taken by a younger Catholic cook from London. Father Hutton had died in 1801, peacefully, in his upstairs room in the London house, having said his last Mass in Maria's chapel earlier that week, and his place had been taken by a younger Douai-trained priest named Father Joseph Yates, who would remain with Maria for the rest of her life. Thomas Walsh had completed 15-year service, and had then left to marry a Catholic widow with a modest inn near Croydon. New servants had come in as time passed to replace those who had moved on. The household in 1815 contained a mix of long-serving and newer faces, but its texture was still the one it had carried on the August evening of 1788, the morning Mass at 7, the household business in the morning, the walk on the seafront, the afternoon visits, the dinner in the evening with whatever friends were in town, the music in the drawing room, the chapel before bed. Mary Seymour, the great love of Maria's later life, lived with Maria at Stein House from her infancy in the late 1790s until her marriage in 1825. She was the daughter of Lord Hugh Seymour, the prince's friend and a naval officer, and of Lady Horatia Seymour, who had died of consumption in 1801. The infant girl had been left to the care of her grandmother, who had also died, and then to the care of her mother's sister, Lady Euston, who had not been able to manage her. Maria had taken her in when she was about 3. The child had grown up calling Maria Mama and had been raised, with Maria's full attention, as her own. There had been a long legal battle in the early 1800s over Mary's custody, the Seymour family, who were Anglican, having tried to take her back. The case had gone to the House of Lords. The prince had supported Maria publicly during the case. In one of the moments of his life, when he had risen to the demands his relationship to her had placed on him, the Lords had ruled in Maria's favour. Mary Seymour had remained with her. The two of them had lived together at Stein House through the long stretch of Maria's late middle age, mother and daughter in everything but the technical fact, with the unfailing affection that would last until Maria's death. Marianne Smythe, the second adopted daughter, was a niece of Maria's, the daughter of her brother Jack Smythe, who had been raised by Maria from her early girlhood. Marianne was less central to Maria's emotional life than Mary Seymour was, but she was a steady presence in the household, and she would, in the end, be the one who was beside Maria in her last hours with Mary Smith and Mary Seymour, who had married and was living elsewhere by then, but who came down to Brighton for the final illness. The friends who came to Steinhouse during this period were the thinning generation who had been her circle in the 1780s and 1790s. Lady Anne Lindsay, who had married Andrew Barnard in 1793 and gone with him to South Africa where he was colonial secretary at the Cape, returned to England after his death in 1807 and resumed her friendship with Maria, although she was now living mostly in London and visited Brighton only occasionally. Lady Bessborough wrote regularly. Lady Sefton, a Catholic friend from Maria's earlier life, came down most summers. The Duchess of Devonshire had died in 1806 of a long illness. Lady Melbourne died in 1818. Sheridan died in poverty and decline in 1816. Fox had died in 1806. The Whig set that had received Maria in her London life was, one by one, going. The friends who replaced them were a younger generation, the children and grandchildren of the original circle, who knew her now as a venerable Catholic lady at Brighton with a remarkable history, rather than as one of their own contemporaries. Through all of this, Mary Smith remained, the constant, the friend who had been there since 1781, the maid who had laced her dress for the secret wedding in 1785, who had held her hand in the carriage afterwards, who had been with her at Margate during the seclusion of 1794, who had returned to her in 1800 when the Prince came back, who had moved with her to Steinhouse in 1812, who was now an old woman herself in the upstairs room, who still came down to dress Maria for dinner and to undress her for bed, although the duties were lighter than they had once been. The relationship between Maria and Mary Smith was, by this point in their lives, the longest sustained relationship of either woman's existence. They had known each other for over 4 decades. They had lived together throughout that time. They were, in everything but the formal designation, family. Maria, in her later life, sometimes said as much, in the subtle ways one acknowledged a relationship of this kind in the period. Mary Smith never said anything of the sort, had been raised in service and not having the vocabulary for it, but the steady fact of her presence said it for her. Brighton itself, during this stretch, was changing in ways that made Maria's late life increasingly unlike the compact, fashionable summer town of 1788, in which she had taken her first house on North Row. The Prince's classical pavilion of 1787 had been progressively remodelled, first under William Porden, who had added the great royal stables in Indian style in 1804, and then, beginning in 1815, under John Nash, who had transformed the whole building into the oriental fantasia of onion domes and pinnacles and chinoiserie that we now know as the Royal Pavilion. The work continued for a long time. Maria, sitting in her drawing room across the Stein, had a direct view of the building rising in its new form, and through the second decade of the 19th century she watched the mixed feelings one would expect of a woman whose former husband was building a Baroque palace within sight of her own sober Regency villa, as the modest classical house she had known in 1788 was buried inside the new Oriental shell. The town changed too. The new Marine Parade running east along the cliff was built up with stuccoed terraces after 1810. The chain pier, the first of Brighton's piers, was built out into the channel in 1823 and immediately became one of the great public attractions of the town, a long iron pier on suspension chains designed by Captain Samuel Brown, on which the visitors strolled to take the air over the open sea. The fishing fleet still went out, but the medieval lanes were now embedded in a much larger town. The population had risen from the 3,500 of 1788 to over 40,000 by the 1830s. The bathing machines were still on the beach, but the bathers were now in the tens of thousands rather than the hundreds. Brighton had become a great resort city. The fashionable village of Maria's young womanhood was nearly unrecognisable. She watched it change with the mild melancholy that an old person feels when the place they have lived in for half a century alters around them. But she was not fundamentally sentimental about it. She liked the new pier. She liked the new buildings, mostly. She liked the larger Catholic community that the growing town had brought in, and that had, in 1798, finally got its first proper Catholic chapel in Brighton, on Margaret Street, which would later be replaced by the larger St. John the Baptist Church, where she would eventually be buried. The Catholic congregation in Brighton grew in her later life from a handful of private chaplains and visitors to a community of several hundred, served by its own clergy, with its own school and its own charitable society, both of which Maria supported generously. She was, by the 1820s, the senior Catholic lady of Brighton, the patron of the parish, the woman to whom the priest came when there was a hardship in the community that needed addressing. She gave with what had become, in her late life, an increasingly free hand. She had spent her life living within her means. In her last decade or so, she relaxed the strict economies of earlier times, and she gave more, in part because she could, and in part because she had outlived most of the people she had been saving for. Her body, which had carried her through all of this, was, by the 1820s, beginning to show its age. She had been, in her young womanhood, a beauty of the reserved kind, with fair hair and grey-blue eyes and the long, composed face that the Reynolds portrait had caught. The hair had whitened. The face had filled out, a little, in the way of women in their 60s. The eyes were the same. The carriage was still upright. The walk on the seafront, which she still took most mornings, was less brisk than it had been, but had not been given up. She had no serious illness, through all that time, that I can find any record of. She had been one of those women who keeps her health into her late 70s through some combination of constitution and habit and luck, and who finally gives way to a relatively short and undramatic final illness in old age. The good Catholic life of moderate eating, moderate drinking, regular sleep, regular prayer, regular walking, regular work, had, in her case, served as a kind of long-term preservative. The prince became king in 1820, on his father's death. He reigned for a decade, increasingly ill, increasingly bloated, increasingly isolated. He never saw Maria again after 1811. He wrote to her once or twice. He did not visit her. He had her painted miniature that she had given him in the 1780s, and he wore it on a chain around his neck for the rest of his life. The manservant who attended him in his last illness in 1830 reported, later, that the king had asked specifically that he be buried with the miniature still on the chain. The request was honoured. He was buried with it. Maria heard of his death by letter from one of his old friends, on the morning of the 26th of June, 1830. She was in her drawing room at Stine House when the letter arrived. She read it. She went up to her chapel and prayed for him for some time. She came down quietly. She told her household. She received the condolences of the friends who came to call. She ordered her servants to put on mourning, which they did, and which she wore herself for the conventional period, despite the fact that her relationship to the dead king had no public name that would have entitled her to mourn him. The new king, William IV, the prince's brother, who had always been fond of Maria, and who had known about the marriage all along, sent her a private letter offering her any help she might need, and confirming that the crown would continue to pay her annuity. He treated her, in his correspondence with her, until her death in 1837, as if she were what she was, his sister-in-law, and addressed her in his letters as such. She was grateful. She was also, by this point, extremely tired. She lived until 1837. The final stretch was quiet. She kept her household. She kept her devotions. Mary Seymour was now married and living elsewhere, but visited regularly. Marianne Smythe, the second adopted daughter, was still with her. The friends who had been her circle in earlier decades had mostly died, but a younger generation had grown up around her, and the visits and the small social rounds continued in their reduced way. She read. She walked more slowly now. She had, in her final stretch, the plain, undramatic decline of an old woman whose health was failing gradually but not painfully. She died at Steinhouse on the 27th of March 1837, at the age of 80. She had been ill for some weeks. She received the last rites from her chaplain. She died peacefully, with Mary Seymour and Marianne Smythe at her bedside, and Mary Smith, her lady's maid of 56-year service, who had been with her since she was 19, holding her hand. Mary Smith herself died in 1845, never having married, never having taken another position. The two of them, mistress and maid, friend and friend, had lived their lives in each other's company, and had ended them in close succession. Maria was buried in St. John, the Baptist Catholic Church in Brighton, in a simple ceremony attended by her family and the Catholic community of Brighton, and a substantial number of the townspeople who knew her in her final stretch as the elderly Catholic lady at Steinhouse who gave generously to the parish poor. Her tomb, which can still be visited, bears the inscription Maria Fitzherbert, with the dates of her life, and 3 carved wedding rings above the inscription, signifying her 3 marriages, the one to Edward Weld, the one to Thomas Fitzherbert, and the only one she truly considered to have been a marriage of her own choice, to George Augustus Frederick, Prince of Wales, later George IV, who had been buried in 1830 with her miniature on a chain around his neck. That is the long arc of the life that the woman in this evening was halfway through, on the Friday in August of 1788, when she has been held in view. She did not know on that night any of what was coming. She did not know about the abandonment of 1794. She did not know about the second marriage to Caroline. She did not know about the 1799 Vatican ruling. She did not know about the good second period from 1800 to 1811. She did not know about the 1811 break. She did not know about the long late life at Steinhouse, the 2 adopted daughters, the death of the prince in 1830 with her miniature, her own death in 1837. What she knew on the night of the Friday in August of 1788 was that she was at home, in her own house, in a town she liked, with her uncle and her chaplain and her friend at dinner, with her household running on its accustomed rhythm, with her chapel upstairs where she would say her evening prayers, with the prince on the other side of the Stein who had come over for half an hour and gone away again, with her bed ready and her sleep ahead, with the long August dark closing over the town and the sea beyond the beach. She had on that night the contented evening that constituted, when one looked at her actual life, the substance of who she was. The dramatic moments would come. They would be survived. They would be absorbed back into the daily texture that was her actual character. She would, from 1788 to 1837, remain the same Maria Fitzherbert, who said her morning mass at 7 and her evening prayers at 11, and walked on the Brighton seafront in the late mornings, and read her French novels in the afternoons, and played her Mozart in the evenings. The pattern was the person. The pattern is what survived. One last thought in closing. The historical memory of Maria Fitzherbert is, as I said at the beginning, almost entirely the memory of her connection to the prince. The biographies tell the love story. The novels romanticize the secret wedding. The popular histories include her in chapters on the Regency court. She appears in dramatizations of George IV's life as the loving and patient Catholic wife who is wronged by the political necessities of the throne. All of this is in some sense true, but it has the accumulating effect of 2 centuries of telling, of reducing her to a function of someone else's story. She was not a function of someone else's story. She was a person with her own house, her own household, her own circle of friends, her own daily devotions, her own taste in music, her own French novels, her own attentiveness to other Catholic widows in difficult circumstances, her own long work of running an establishment well, her own widowhood of 4.5 decades, her own dignity, her own faith, her own end. The evening I have just walked you through is one evening of that life. It is, as I said, one of perhaps 1,000 similar evenings. The one is meant in the particular way that history can sometimes use the particular to suggest the general to stand for the others. This evening, the chess game in the corner, the music at the pianoforte, the friend on the sofa, the chaplain saying his office through the door, the prince briefly visiting and going, the candle taken up the stairs, the prayers in the chapel, the candle blown out, the long night of sleep. This evening was her life. The other things, the dramatic things, were not her life. They were the things that happened to her life. There is a difference. The difference is the whole of the meaning. If you are going to remember her after tonight, remember this. Not the secret wedding, not the parliamentary denial, not the abandonment, not the deathbed miniature. Those are the things that history did to her. Remember instead the small steady fact that she said her morning mass and her evening prayers, that she ran her household with care, that she walked in the morning along the seafront in the late August sunshine, that she sat in her drawing room with her uncle and her chaplain and her friend, that she played Mozart at the pianoforte, that she sang Purcell with her soft, careful voice, that she went up the stairs to her chapel and knelt at the bench and said the slow Latin words that she had been saying every night since she was a girl in Paris. Remember that she kept her household through a 56-year span with the same lady's maid. Remember that she raised 2 adopted daughters with the patience and the reliable affection she had not been able to give to any biological children of her own. Remember that she gave generously to Catholic charities for 4.5 decades without making any public statement of her giving. Remember that she carried through every crisis of her life the daily religious practice that her French nuns had taught her when she was 11. Remember that she was, when she died, lying in her own bed in her own house with her adopted daughter and her niece and her oldest friend in the world holding her hand. Remember that she had built that ending herself through the long attentive work of her ordinary days. Remember her at her own pianoforte, in her own house, with the candles burning down on the Friday evening in August of 1788, when she was aged 32, and the long second half of her life was still ahead of her, and the pattern of who she was had been set and would hold through everything until the end. The candle is blown out. The room is dark. The house is quiet. Brighton sleeps around it. The sea breathes its slow late summer rhythm. The stars wheel over the small fashionable town. The night holds the woman who has gone to bed in the upstairs back room of the modest house on North Row, who is sleeping the calm sleep of the well-ordered Catholic life, who is dreaming perhaps of nothing in particular, the way one dreams at the end of an ordinary day. Sleep with her. Sleep with the small honoured presence of a woman whose history has wronged her by reducing her, and who is being given back, for the narrow space of this listening, her actual life as she lived it. The morning mass tomorrow, the breakfast, the walk with Lady Anne, the pattern, the long ordinary continuing pattern of who she was. Good night to her. Good night to you. Sleep well.